Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Night Story, and welcome to tonight's journey toward peaceful sleep. If you're enjoying this content, I would be so grateful if you could take a moment to like this video. I'd also love to hear from you. Please feel free to share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Your kind support truly helps me continue creating these relaxing experiences for you. Now please make yourself comfortable as we gently begin tonight's journey to restful sleep. The symbols on the wall aren't human, I know that now. Whatever made them had fingers or appendages far too long and numerous to be one of us. I'm recording this because I don't think any of us will make it back to the surface. If you're hearing this, don't send anyone else. Seal the entrance. Forget we were ever here. The wind howled across the desolate Antarctic landscape as our research vessel cut through the frigid waters. January 2025. The height of the Antarctic summer, though that meant little in a place where temperatures still hovered well below freezing most days. I adjusted my thermal gear as I stared out at the endless expanse of white. As the lead geologist for the International Antarctic Research Coalition, I had spent the better part of a decade studying the continent's hidden terrain. My name is Dr. James Harper, and what began as a routine expedition would soon become the most terrifying experience of my life. Dr. Harper, you might want to see this, called Dr. Amelia Frost, our glaciologist. Her voice carried an unusual edge that immediately caught my attention. I made my way to the ship's research lab where Amelia had been analyzing recent radar imaging data. The technology we used, ground-penetrating radar capable of seeing through nearly a mile of ice, had been developed specifically for this expedition. "We've been focusing on the wrong area," she said, her eyes fixed on the screen. "Look at these readings from the eastern ridge." The display showed what appeared to be vast hollow spaces beneath the ice sheet, spaces that shouldn't exist naturally. Most intriguing was their geometric arrangement, suggesting an organized structure. "Could be a volcanic formation," I offered, though I didn't believe it myself. Antarctica has numerous volcanoes, many still active, creating cave systems through geothermal heating. But this was different. "Not unless volcanoes have started building in perfect hexagonal patterns," Amelia replied, enlarging the image. "These formations are too precise, too ordered. There's no natural explanation." Dr. Wei Lin, our physicist, joined us at the monitor. "The density readings are inconsistent with ice caves. Whatever these spaces are, they're reinforced with something much harder." A week later, our team of 8 researchers established Base Camp Alpha on the surface above the anomaly. The location was remote, even by Antarctic standards, over 200 miles from the nearest research station, in a region rarely visited due to its particularly harsh conditions. The drilling operation began immediately. Using specialized thermal drills, we bored through the ice at a rate of approximately 15 meters per hour. At that pace, we estimated it would take nearly 3 days to reach the uppermost chamber of whatever lay below. On the second night, as temperatures plunged to 40 degrees Celsius and winds battered our reinforced shelters, I awoke to a strange vibration. At first, I thought it was the generator malfunctioning, but when I checked the equipment, everything was functioning normally. The vibration seemed to be coming from beneath us, from the ice itself. By the third day, we had penetrated nearly 700 meters of solid ice. The drill's progress suddenly accelerated as it broke through into an open space. We carefully extracted the equipment and peered down into the darkness below. "Time to go where no one has gone in a very long time," I said, securing my descent gear. Our team's engineer, Dr. Robert Walsh, went first, followed by me and then the others. The shaft we'd created opened into a massive chamber that left us all speechless. Our powerful lights revealed walls of a material that resembled obsidian, but seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. The floor was perfectly level, covered in a thin layer of ice that crunched beneath our boots. But what truly stunned us were the symbols, intricate patterns carved into the walls that resembled no written language any of us had ever encountered. They appeared to flow and shift as our lights moved across them, creating an unsettling optical illusion. "This is impossible," whispered Dr. Claudia Hernandez, our archaeologist. "Human civilization never reached Antarctica before the 20th century. These markings would have had to be made before the continent was covered in ice, over 100,000 years ago. Who said anything about humans? Dr. Lin replied quietly. We all felt it then, the acute awareness that we were standing in something that completely upended our understanding of Earth's history. But none of us yet realized we had also made ourselves prey. 3 days after our initial descent, we had established a fully functional research outpost inside the main chamber. Equipment hummed as Dr. Lin conducted material analyses while Dr. Hernandez meticulously photographed and cataloged the strange symbols that covered nearly every surface. The material isn't volcanic, Lin announced, looking up from his portable spectrometer. It's some kind of composite, carbon-based, but with elements I can't identify with our equipment. The patterns appear to be mathematical in nature, Claudia added. They repeat in sequences that suggest they're communicating information, not just decorative. I ran my gloved hand along one of the walls, feeling an almost imperceptible vibration, the same I'd felt that night in my tent. How old would you estimate this structure to be? Claudia hesitated. Based on the ice layering above us and the erosion patterns, I'd say at least 30,000 years old. But honestly, it could be much older. What we discovered was beyond extraordinary. It was impossible by any conventional understanding of human history. The structure extended far beyond the main chamber, with corridors branching off in multiple directions. We had only explored a fraction of it. Dr. Walsh had been working on creating a three-dimensional map of the structure using portable sonar equipment. You need to see this, he called out, gesturing us over to his workstation. The display showed what appeared to be a massive complex extending for kilometers in all directions. The main chamber where we had set up our base was just the uppermost portion of something that reached much deeper into the ice. It's like a city, Walsh said, his voice hushed with awe. A subterranean city built before Antarctica was even covered in ice. We need to explore further, I decided. Amelia, you and Robert stay here and maintain communication. The rest of us will follow the main corridor and see where it leads. Dr. Frost looked uneasy. The temperature readings down that corridor are unusual. They increase rather than decrease with depth. That shouldn't be possible without a heat source. All the more reason to investigate, I replied. Our team of 6 moved deeper into the structure following the widest corridor. Our headlamps and portable lights created dancing shadows that seemed to follow us as we descended. The corridor sloped downward at a gentle angle, taking us deeper beneath the ice. After nearly an hour of walking, we noticed a change in the environment. The temperature had indeed risen noticeably, from the frigid 15 degrees of the main chamber to almost 0 degrees C. Condensation formed on the walls, creating thin rivulets of water that ran down to the floor. Do you hear that? Dr. Hernandez suddenly asked, stopping in her tracks. We all went silent, straining to listen. At first, I heard nothing but the sound of water dripping. Then I detected it, a low, pulsating hum that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It's getting louder as we go deeper, Dr. Lin observed. The corridor widened into another chamber, much larger than the one we had established as our base. Unlike the upper chamber, this one showed signs of damage. Sections of the wall had collapsed and debris littered the floor. But what truly drew our attention was at the center of the room. A circular platform rose from the floor, and upon it stood what could only be described as a device, a complex arrangement of the same dark material as the walls, with intricate patterns that glowed with a faint blue luminescence. It's active, Dr. Lin whispered in disbelief. After all this time, it's still functioning. As we approached the platform, the humming intensified, and the blue glow pulsed in rhythm with the sound. None of us recognized the technology. It didn't resemble anything in our scientific understanding. Dr. Hernandez reached out toward one of the glowing patterns. Wait! I shouted, but it was too late. Her finger made contact with the surface, and the hum immediately rose to a deafening pitch. The blue glow intensified, becoming almost blinding. The entire chamber began to vibrate violently. We need to get out, I yelled above the noise, grabbing Claudia's arm and pulling her back. As we rushed toward the corridor, the ground beneath us trembled. Chunks of the ceiling broke loose, crashing around us. Dr. Lin was struck by falling debris and went down hard. Two of our team members helped him up as we stumbled back toward the upper chamber. The vibrations continued, growing stronger with each passing moment. When we finally reached our base, Amelia and Robert were frantically gathering essential equipment. "What happened?" Amelia demanded. "The entire structure is shifting. We're detecting massive movement in the ice above us." "We need to evacuate now," I ordered. "Grab only what you can carry." As we hurried toward the shaft that led to the surface, Dr. Walsh's monitoring equipment emitted a series of urgent beeps. He glanced at the screen, his face draining of color. "The shaft. It's closing," he said in horror. On the display, we could see that the ice around our entry point was shifting, the opening narrowing rapidly. Our escape route was being sealed before our eyes. We were trapped, with something ancient awakening beneath us. 24 hours after losing our exit to the surface, we had established that the upper chamber remained the safest location within the structure. The violent tremors had subsided, but occasional vibrations still rippled through the walls, reminding us that whatever had been activated remained operational. Dr. Lin had recovered from his injuries, mostly bruises and a mild concussion, but our situation was growing increasingly desperate. Communications with the surface had been severed when the shaft collapsed and our supplies were limited. "We need to find another way out," I said during our team meeting. "The sonar mapping shows several other corridors we haven't explored yet." "After what happened last time, you want to go deeper?" Dr. Frost asked incredulously. "We don't have much choice," I replied. "We have about 5 days of supplies. If we stay here, we'll simply starve or freeze once the generators run out of fuel." Dr. Hernandez had been unusually quiet since the incident with the device. She sat slightly apart from the group, obsessively reviewing the photographs of the symbols she had taken. "I think I'm beginning to understand some of it," she said suddenly, drawing everyone's attention. "These aren't just mathematical sequences, they're directions, a map." She spread several images on the table. "See these recurring patterns? They appear at junction points in the corridors. I believe they're labeling different sections of the structure." "Can you tell which might lead to an exit?" I asked. Claudia pointed to one particular symbol that appeared more frequently than others. "This one appears to indicate upward movement or ascension. If we follow the corridors where this symbol appears, it might lead us to another way out." With renewed purpose, we prepared for another expedition into the depths. This time, we moved as a complete group, unwilling to risk being separated. Dr. Hernandez led the way, following the symbols she believed would guide us to salvation. The corridor she chose was narrower than the main one, requiring us to proceed in single file. Unlike the obsidian-like material of the main chambers, these walls were embedded with crystalline structures that caught and refracted our lights, creating a disorienting effect. After nearly 2 hours of careful progress, the corridor opened into a space unlike anything we had seen before. Massive cylindrical structures filled the room, arranged in concentric circles. Each cylinder was approximately 3 meters tall and made of the same transparent crystalline material as the structures in the walls. "What are these?" Dr. Walsh wondered aloud, approaching one of the cylinders. As his light illuminated the interior, he recoiled in shock. Inside, suspended in a clear, viscous fluid, was what appeared to be a preserved organism, but unlike any life form known to science. The creature was roughly humanoid in shape, but possessed elongated limbs with too many joints. Its hands, if they could be called that, had 7 digits of unequal length. The head was elongated and featureless, except for what appeared to be sensory pits, where eyes might be expected. "God in heaven," whispered Dr. Frost, her scientific detachment momentarily shattered. As we moved through the room, we discovered dozens more cylinders, each containing different specimens. Some resembled the first humanoid creature, while others were utterly alien, organisms with radial symmetry, beings with exoskeletons, entities that defied classification. "It's an archive," Dr. Lin said with dawning comprehension. "A biological archive." Dr. Hernandez had moved to a wall covered in more of the strange symbols. "These appear to be descriptions or classifications," she said, "like a catalog of species." The implications were staggering. We weren't simply looking at an ancient structure. We were standing in a repository of biological information created by an advanced civilization that had existed in Antarctica before the ice. As we continued through the archive, the cylinders changed. The preserved specimens became increasingly familiar. Primitive mammals, early hominids, and eventually, unmistakably human forms. They were studying us, Dr. Lin whispered, cataloging Earth's evolution. At the center of the archive stood a cylinder larger than the others. Unlike the preservation units, this one appeared to be some kind of interface, a control terminal. Symbols scrolled across its surface in sequences too rapid to follow. "It's active," Dr. Walsh said, examining the terminal without touching it. "And I think it's connected to whatever system was triggered in the lower chamber." As if responding to his words, the terminal's display changed. The scrolling symbols were replaced by what appeared to be a three-dimensional map of the entire structure, and beyond it, the outline of something massive, buried even deeper in the ice. "What is that?" I asked, pointing to the larger structure. Before anyone could respond, a new vibration began, different from the violent tremors earlier. This was a steady, rhythmic pulsation that seemed to emanate from directly beneath us. The terminal's display changed again, showing a sequence of symbols that Dr. Hernandez frantically tried to interpret. "It's some kind of countdown," she said, her voice tight with tension, "or an activation sequence." The pulsations intensified, and the crystalline structures in the walls began to glow with the same blue luminescence we had seen in the device chamber. "We need to leave," I ordered. "Now." As we turned to retreat, the entrance through which we had come suddenly sealed, a transparent barrier materializing from the walls. We were trapped in the archive as the countdown continued its inexorable progression. The terminal's display changed once more, projecting a three-dimensional image into the center of the room. It showed the Antarctic continent, then zoomed out to display the entire Earth. A series of points illuminated across the globe's surface, locations that corresponded to major population centers. With horrifying clarity, I understood what we had stumbled upon. This wasn't simply an archive or a research facility. It was something far more sinister, a facility designed to monitor, study, and perhaps control Earth's evolution. And we had just reactivated it after tens of thousands of years of dormancy. The barrier that had sealed us in the archive chamber dissolved as suddenly as it had appeared, but none of us felt relieved. The pulsations continued, growing stronger, and the blue glow from the walls intensified. "The countdown is still progressing," Dr. Hernandez warned, studying the terminal's display. "Whatever process we've initiated, it's continuing." "We need to find a way to shut it down," I said, trying to maintain calm despite the growing dread in my chest. Dr. Lin had been examining the terminal closely, careful not to touch its surface. "This appears to be monitoring energy distribution throughout the facility. Power is being directed to the deepest level. Here." He pointed to a section of the three-dimensional map that pulsed with increasing brightness. "That's where we need to go," I decided. "If we can reach the main power source, we might be able to deactivate it. Or we could trigger something worse," Dr. Frost countered. "We have no idea what we're dealing with here." "What choice do we have?" I asked. "Wait here until whatever is happening reaches completion?" No one argued further. We gathered our equipment and followed the map displayed on the terminal, heading toward a corridor that descended even deeper into the structure. The passage sloped steeply downward, taking us hundreds of meters below the archive chamber. The temperature continued to rise, uncomfortably so, reaching nearly 20 degrees. The walls here were different, lined with what appeared to be conduits that pulsed with energy, the blue glow flowing like blood through veins. As we descended, I became aware of a change in the air. A strange scent that was neither pleasant nor offensive, just utterly foreign. The humidity had increased dramatically, making it difficult to breathe. "Does anyone else hear that?" Dr. Walsh asked suddenly, stopping in his tracks. We all went silent, listening intently. At first I heard nothing beyond the omnipresent hum of the facility. Then I detected it, a faint scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor somewhere ahead of us. "Could be structural movement," I suggested, though I didn't believe it myself. We proceeded with increased caution, our lights probing the darkness ahead. The corridor widened into another chamber, but unlike the ordered spaces above, this one showed signs of chaos. Equipment, or what we assumed was equipment, lay scattered and broken. The walls bore marks that looked disturbingly like claw marks, deep gouges in material we had found impenetrable elsewhere. "Something happened here," Dr. Hernandez whispered, examining the damage. "Some kind of conflict or containment breach." The scraping sound came again, louder this time, and accompanied by a wet, shuffling noise. It was coming from a dark recess at the far end of the chamber. I signaled for everyone to remain still as I directed my light toward the source of the sound. For a moment, the beam illuminated nothing but damaged walls. Then something moved, a glistening, amorphous shape that seemed to recoil from the light. "Turn off your lights," Dr. Lin whispered urgently. "All of them now." Without questioning, we extinguished our lights, plunging the chamber into darkness. The only illumination came from the pulsing blue conduits in the walls, casting everything in an eerie, shifting glow. In that dim light, I could make out the shape more clearly. It wasn't amorphous as I had first thought, but a creature, vaguely humanoid, but with proportions all wrong. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending in impossible directions. The skin, if it could be called skin, glistened wetly, as if coated in some kind of secretion. "Don't move," Dr. Lin breathed, barely audible. "It's responding to movement and direct light." We stood frozen as the creature tilted what passed for its head, as if sensing our presence despite the darkness. It made a soft clicking sound that echoed through the chamber. From elsewhere in the darkness came an answering click. Then another. And another. There were more of them. "We need to back away," I whispered. Slowly. Toward the corridor. As we began to retreat, one of our team, Dr. Moreno, our junior researcher, lost his footing on the uneven floor. The sound of his stumble, though slight, was enough. The creature's head snapped in our direction, and it emitted a high-pitched shriek that pierced my eardrums like a physical force. The others responded immediately, their shapes emerging from the shadows all around us. "Run!" I shouted, abandoning stealth. We bolted for the corridor, fumbling to reactivate our lights. Behind us, the creatures moved with terrifying speed, their limbs propelling them in a grotesque parody of human movement. Dr. Moreno was the last in our group. As he reached the corridor entrance, one of the creatures lunged, its elongated fingers, too many fingers, grasping his ankle. He screamed as he was pulled backward into the darkness. I turned to help him, but Dr. Walsh grabbed my arm. "It's too late, we have to keep moving." Moreno's screams echoed behind us as we fled up the corridor, the sounds of pursuit close behind. The creatures moved differently in the confined space, crawling along the walls and ceiling with insect-like agility. We reached a junction and took a sharp turn, following a passage that led laterally rather than upward. The pursuing sounds began to fade, but we didn't slow our pace until we were certain we had lost them. Finally, gasping for breath, we stopped in a small alcove to regroup. Dr. Moreno was gone, the first casualty of our expedition into this nightmare. "What were those things?" Dr. Frost asked, her voice trembling. "I think they were maintenance workers," Dr. Lin said grimly, "or security. They looked like the specimens we saw in the archive, but altered, adapted for specific functions." "You're saying they were engineered?" I asked. "This entire facility was designed to monitor and manipulate evolution," he replied. "Those creatures could be the result of genetic experimentation, or perhaps the original builders themselves, adapted to survive the changing conditions." The implications were horrifying. If these entities had been sealed away beneath the ice for tens of thousands of years and were still active, what else might be waiting in the deeper levels? Our immediate concern, however, was finding a way back to the upper chambers. The map we had seen on the terminal was now our only guide, committed imperfectly to memory. "We need to keep moving," I said. "Find another route upward." As we continued through the unfamiliar corridors, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded, that our choices were being subtly manipulated by the design of the facility itself. Every junction seemed to lead us deeper rather than higher, despite our best efforts to ascend. The countdown we had seen on the terminal continued in my mind. Whatever was awakening in the depths of this place, we were running out of time to stop it. We had been moving through the labyrinthine corridors for what felt like hours, each attempt to find an upward path thwarted by sealed passages or routes that ultimately led downward. Our team had grown quiet, save for necessary communication. The loss of Dr. Moreno hung over us like a shroud. "We're being directed," Dr. Hernandez said finally, voicing what I had suspected. "The facility is guiding our movement." "Toward what?" Dr. Walsh asked. "The core," Dr. Lin answered, "where the power is being concentrated." The corridors had gradually changed as we progressed. The material of the walls had become more transparent, revealing complex mechanisms behind them, pulsing with energy that flowed toward some central point ahead of us. We eventually emerged onto a walkway that encircled a massive vertical shaft. Looking down, I saw what could only be described as the heart of the facility, a colossal column of energy that pulsed with the same blue luminescence we had seen throughout the structure, but intensified 100-fold. "It's some kind of reactor," Dr. Lin said, his scientific curiosity momentarily overriding his fear. "But not nuclear or any other power source I recognize." The shaft extended both above and below us, disappearing into darkness in both directions. Walkways spiraled around it, connecting to chambers that ringed the central core. "Look there." Dr. Frost pointed to a structure that extended into the energy column from one of the lower levels. "That looks like a control interface." "Then that's where we need to go," I said. We followed the walkway downward, circling the energy core. As we descended, I noticed movement in some of the chambers connected to the central shaft. More of the creatures we had encountered earlier, but engaged in what appeared to be maintenance activities. They moved with purpose, adjusting mechanisms and monitoring displays with their too-many-fingered hands. "They're preparing something," Dr. Hernandez whispered as we observed their activity. "The facility is being reactivated systematically." We reached the level with the control interface without being detected. The chamber was mercifully empty of the creatures, though evidence of their recent presence was clear. Tools or devices left on surfaces, displays active with scrolling symbols. Dr. Lin immediately began examining the interface, which consisted of multiple crystalline panels arranged around a central terminal. "This is incredible technology," he said. "It appears to be controlling energy distribution throughout the entire facility, but also something else." "Can you shut it down?" I asked. "I'm not sure. The system is complex beyond anything I've ever seen, but there seems to be a pattern to the control sequences." Dr. Hernandez joined him, studying the symbols on the displays. "These are similar to what we saw in the archive. I think this section relates to external communications." "Communications with what?" Dr. Walsh asked. "Based on the star patterns displayed here," she said, pointing to one screen. "I'd say it's attempting to establish contact with something very far away." The implication was clear and terrifying. The facility wasn't just awakening, it was calling out, sending a signal to whoever or whatever had built it. Dr. Lin continued his analysis of the interface. "I think I can disrupt the power flow to the transmission array," he said after several tense minutes, "but I need to understand the sequencing better." While Lin and Hernandez worked on the interface, the rest of us kept watch for any approaching creatures. The energy core pulsed with increasing intensity, the rhythm matching the countdown we had seen earlier. "I've found it," Dr. Lin announced suddenly. "This sequence controls the main power distribution. If I can reverse it..." He began manipulating the crystalline panels, following patterns he had identified. The energy core's pulsations faltered momentarily, then resumed with greater intensity. "Something's wrong," he said, his fingers moving faster across the interface. "The system is resisting the changes." Alarms began to sound throughout the facility, not mechanical sirens, but a resonant tone that seemed to vibrate through the very structure itself. The creatures in the surrounding chambers reacted immediately, their movements becoming more urgent. "They know we're interfering," Dr. Walsh warned. "We need to hurry." Dr. Lin continued his attempts to disrupt the system, but the interface had begun to change under his hands, reconfiguring itself to prevent his interference. "It's adaptive," he said in frustration. "The more I try to shut it down, the more it learns to resist." Suddenly, the displays on all the panels changed simultaneously, showing the same image, the map of Earth we had seen in the archive, but now with a single location highlighted. It was our exact position in Antarctica. "What's happening?" I asked, a sense of dread building in my chest. "I think," Dr. Lin began, but was cut off as the energy core flared blindingly bright. A pulse of energy erupted from the core, traveling upward through the shaft with incredible speed. The entire facility shuddered with its passage. "What did you do?" Dr. Frost demanded. "Nothing," Lin replied, his face pale. "It wasn't me. The system executed its own command sequence." "The signal," Dr. Hernandez whispered. "It just sent the signal." Before we could process this development, the displays changed again. They now showed what appeared to be a countdown. But unlike the one we had seen earlier, this one was much shorter, and it was accelerating. "We need to get out of here," I said, "now." As we turned to leave, we found our exit blocked. One of the creatures stood in the doorway, but this one was different from those we had encountered before. It was larger, its limbs more proportionate, its features more defined. It wore what appeared to be some kind of armor or protective covering. It regarded us with what I could only interpret as curiosity, tilting its head in that unsettling way. Then it spoke. Not in any human language, but in a series of clicks and modulated tones that somehow conveyed meaning directly to my mind. "The awakening has begun," the meaning formed in my thoughts. "The masters will return." Dr. Hernandez stepped forward, attempting to communicate. "We don't understand. Who are the masters?" The creature's response came as a series of images rather than words. Visions of beings arriving from above, of massive constructions across the Antarctic continent, of experiments conducted on primitive life forms. The message was clear. The builders of this facility had come from elsewhere, using Earth as a laboratory for their experiments in biological engineering. "The signal has been sent," the creature continued. "This facility will now prepare for their arrival." "How long?" I asked, the question forming in my mind rather than spoken aloud. Another series of images, the sun rising and setting many times, but not an infinite number. Weeks, perhaps months. "You are unexpected variables," the creature conveyed. "Your presence was not anticipated in the reactivation protocols. You will be studied." The threat was implicit but clear. We were no longer explorers or scientists. We were specimens to be examined and catalogued like the preserved entities in the archive. "We need to leave," I projected the thought forcefully. "Return to the surface." "The surface is being prepared," came the response. "The ice will recede. The masters require access." With horrifying clarity, I understood the purpose of the energy pulse. It wasn't just a signal to distant beings, but the initiation of a process to transform the environment around the facility, to melt the ice that had hidden it for millennia. Before we could react further, more creatures appeared behind the first, these resembling the maintenance entities we had seen earlier. They carried devices I didn't recognize but assumed were weapons. "You will come," the lead creature commanded. "Resistance is unnecessary and inefficient." We were surrounded, outnumbered, and in the heart of a facility we barely understood. But I knew with absolute certainty that if we submitted, we would never see the surface again, except perhaps as specimens in new archive cylinders. "Now!" I shouted, grabbing a piece of equipment from a nearby surface and hurling it at the energy core. The improvised projectile struck one of the conduits feeding into the core, causing a shower of sparks and a surge of energy that momentarily blinded everyone in the chamber. In that moment of confusion, we ran, pushing past the disoriented creatures and into the corridor beyond. Alarms continued to sound throughout the facility, and we could hear the pursuers recovering behind us. We fled upward, following the spiral walkway around the energy core, searching desperately for any path that might lead to the surface, and a warning for the world above about what was awakening beneath the ice. The pursuit was relentless. As we climbed the spiraling walkway around the energy core, creatures emerged from connecting chambers at every level, forcing us to fight or flee at each encounter. We had fashioned makeshift weapons from broken equipment, but they were pitifully inadequate against beings that seemed impervious to pain and fatigue. Dr. Walsh was the next to fall. As we reached a junction between the central shaft and a major corridor, a group of the maintenance creatures ambushed us. Walsh pushed Dr. Frost clear of an attack, taking the brunt of it himself. The creatures dragged him away before we could help, his screams echoing through the facility until they were suddenly, horrifically silenced. Our group was now reduced to 5. Myself, Dr. Frost, Dr. Lin, Dr. Hernandez, and Dr. Kent. Our atmospheric specialist, who had remained largely silent throughout our ordeal, documenting everything in a small notebook he kept in his pocket. "We can't keep running blindly," Dr. Frost said as we paused to catch our breath in a momentarily secure alcove. "We need a plan." "The creatures seem to be concentrated around the core," Dr. Lin observed. "If we can move radially outward, away from the center, we might encounter fewer of them." Dr. Hernandez had been studying the symbols on the walls. "These directional markers are consistent. This symbol appears to indicate peripheral systems." She pointed to a recurring pattern. "If we follow it, it might lead us to the outer sections of the facility." With no better option, we followed her guidance, taking corridors that led away from the central shaft. The pulsing blue light grew dimmer as we moved outward, and the temperature began to drop, a sign that we were approaching the exterior of the structure. The alarm tones had changed, becoming more urgent, but also more distant. Whatever was happening in the core, it was progressing without our interference. After what felt like hours of careful movement, avoiding patrolling creatures whenever possible, we reached a section that was noticeably different from the rest of the facility. The walls here were thicker, reinforced, and the passages narrower. "I think these are access tunnels," Dr. Lin said, examining the construction. "Possibly maintenance routes to the exterior." The tunnel sloped upward at a steeper angle than any passage we had encountered before. Hope, the first I had felt since our discovery of the archive, began to build in my chest. We might actually find a way out. As we ascended through the tunnels, I noticed something strange about the material of the walls. Unlike the obsidian-like substance of the main chambers, these were constructed of a composite that included what appeared to be metal, actual, recognizable metal. "These sections were added later," Dr. Hernandez said, confirming my suspicion. "They're not original to the facility. The construction is different, more recent." "Recent as in thousands rather than tens of thousands of years?" I asked. "Possibly," she replied. "There are signs of multiple modifications over time." The implication was unsettling. If the facility had been maintained and modified periodically throughout its history, then it had never been truly dormant, just waiting, preparing for the right moment to fully reactivate. We continued upward until the tunnel terminated at what appeared to be a dead end. But upon closer examination, we discovered it was actually a hatch or door of some kind, sealed shut with no visible mechanism to open it. "It has to open somehow," Dr. Frost said, running her hands along the seams of the hatch. "There must be a control panel or—" Her words were cut short as the entire tunnel shook violently. Dust and fragments rained down from the ceiling as the vibration intensified. "The melt sequence," Dr. Lin said grimly. "It's accelerating. The energy pulse is being directed upward through the ice." Another tremor, stronger than the first, nearly knocked us off our feet. A crack appeared in the ceiling of the tunnel, widening rapidly as the shaking continued. "Take cover!" I shouted as chunks of material began to fall. We pressed ourselves against the walls as the tunnel partially collapsed, debris filling the passage behind us. When the dust settled, we found ourselves trapped, the way back blocked by rubble, the way forward sealed by the mysterious hatch. "Now what?" Dr. Kent asked, speaking for the first time in hours. Before anyone could respond, the hatch in front of us began to move. It rotated slowly, like the door of a vault, revealing darkness beyond. Cold air rushed in, genuinely cold, not the artificial chill of the facility's environmental systems, Antarctic air. "It leads outside," Dr. Frost said, her voice tight with desperate hope. As the hatch fully opened, we found ourselves looking not at the surface, but at another tunnel, this one roughly hewn from ice rather than constructed of manufactured materials. It sloped upward at a steep angle, disappearing into darkness. "An escape route," Dr. Hernandez breathed. "But built by whom? And when?" There was no time to ponder these questions. Behind us, through the partially collapsed tunnel, we could hear the sounds of pursuit, the clicking communication of the creatures as they tracked us. We entered the ice tunnel, using our remaining lights to illuminate the way. The passage was narrow, requiring us to proceed in single file, and the floor was slick with ice, making progress treacherous. After climbing for what seemed like an eternity, the tunnel leveled out, opening into a small chamber carved from the ice. The walls here were covered in markings, but not the alien symbols of the facility below. These were unmistakably human in origin, crude pictographs alongside what appeared to be early forms of writing. "These are ancient," Dr. Hernandez said, examining the markings with professional interest despite our dire situation. "Possibly thousands of years old, but definitely made by humans." "Are you saying humans knew about the facility?" Dr. Frost asked. "That they found it before us?" "Not just found it," Dr. Hernandez replied. "Based on these symbols, they encountered the beings that operated it. Look here. These depictions show conflict, warfare." The pictographs told a grim story. Human figures in combat with elongated, many-limbed entities. Other images showed humans fleeing, hiding, and finally sealing something away beneath the ice. "They fought them," I said, "and somehow managed to disable or contain the facility. Until we came along and reactivated it," Dr. Lin added grimly. Before we could fully process this revelation, another tremor shook the ice chamber, more violent than any before. Cracks spread across the ceiling and walls with alarming speed. "Move!" I shouted as chunks of ice began to fall. We scrambled through an opening on the far side of the chamber, emerging into another ice tunnel that continued upward. Behind us, the chamber collapsed entirely, sealing the way back. The tremors continued as we climbed, growing more frequent and intense. The ice around us groaned and shifted, threatening to crush us at any moment. "The heat from the energy pulse is melting the ice sheet from below," Dr. Lin explained as we climbed. "The entire structure is becoming unstable." After what felt like hours of desperate ascent, we noticed a change in the quality of light ahead. Not the artificial illumination of our equipment, but a diffuse, natural glow. "Daylight," Dr. Frost said, her pace quickening despite her exhaustion. The tunnel ended at a narrow crevasse that opened to the surface. Sunlight, the perpetual daylight of the Antarctic summer, streamed through the opening. One by one, we squeezed through the crevasse, emerging onto the surface of the ice sheet. The relief of escape was immediately tempered by what we saw. The ice around us was fracturing, massive cracks spreading outward from a central point like a spider's web. In the center, where our original camp had been established, a depression had formed, the ice visibly sinking as it melted from below. "It's happening already," Dr. Lin said, his voice hollow with dread. "The facility is melting its way to the surface." In the distance, our research vessel was still visible where we had left it, apparently undamaged by the seismic activity. If we could reach it, we might escape and warn the world. "We need to move quickly," I said. "The ice could give way completely at any moment." As we started toward the vessel, Dr. Kent suddenly stopped, looking back at the deepening depression. "They'll follow us," he said quietly. "Once they reach the surface, there will be nothing to stop them from spreading across the continent, across the world." "We can alert the authorities," Dr. Frost argued. "Get military intervention." "By then it will be too late," Kent replied. He reached into his pack and removed a small device, one I recognized with immediate alarm. "Is that what I think it is?" I asked. Kent nodded. "A thermal charge. I brought it for ice core sampling, but it has other applications." The implication was clear. The charge could potentially collapse the opening to the facility, sealing it once more beneath the ice, at least temporarily. "You'd never get away in time," Dr. Hernandez said, understanding immediately. "No," Kent agreed. "I wouldn't." Before any of us could stop him, Kent turned and began walking back toward the depression. "Get to the ship," he called over his shoulder. "Tell them what we found. Tell them to be ready." We watched in stunned silence as he made his way across the fracturing ice, his figure growing smaller with distance. "We have to go," I said finally, pulling the others toward the vessel. "We can't let his sacrifice be in vain." As we ran, navigating the increasingly unstable ice field, I glanced back one last time. Kent had reached the edge of the depression and was descending into it, the device clutched in his hand. We had almost reached the vessel when it happened. A flash of light, blindingly bright even in the Antarctic daylight, erupted from the depression. The shockwave hit us seconds later, knocking us to the ground as the ice beneath us heaved and buckled. When we regained our feet, the depression had collapsed in on itself, forming a massive crater. Plumes of steam rose from its depths, quickly freezing in the bitter air. Kent was gone, but he had bought us time, and perhaps saved countless lives in doing so. We boarded the vessel in silence, each lost in our own thoughts as we prepared to depart. As the engines rumbled to life, Dr. Hernandez joined me at the stern, looking back at the crater that marked the site of our discovery. "It won't hold them for long," she said quietly. "The facility was too extensive, too powerful. What Kent did was brave, but we need to prepare," I finished for her, "for when they reach the surface again." She nodded, her expression grim. "The ancient humans who found them before, they managed to contain the threat somehow. We need to find out how they did it." As our vessel moved away from the ice shelf, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not just by the entities in the facility below, but by something more distant, something that had received the signal and was now turning its attention toward Earth after millennia of absence. The awakening had begun, and humanity was not prepared for what was coming. 3 weeks after our escape from Antarctica, I sat in a sterile conference room at the headquarters of the International Antarctic Research Coalition in Geneva. The debriefing had been ongoing for days, exhaustive interviews with intelligence agencies, military officials, and scientific authorities from a dozen nations. Few believed our account. Despite the video evidence we had managed to salvage, despite the seismic readings that confirmed a massive event at our research site, despite the satellite imagery showing a new crater in the ice where our base camp had been, most dismissed our story as hallucination induced by extreme conditions. Or worse, a hoax. "You have to understand our position, Dr. Harper," said General Williams of the United States Strategic Command. "You're asking us to believe that an alien facility has been hidden under the Antarctic ice for tens of thousands of years, that it's now reactivating, and that hostile non-human entities are preparing for the arrival of their, what did you call them, masters?" "That's correct," I replied, too exhausted to be diplomatic anymore. "And every moment we waste in denial brings us closer to a catastrophe beyond our comprehension." The general exchanged glances with his colleagues, representatives from Russia, China, the European Union, and others. Their skepticism was palpable. "We've dispatched reconnaissance teams to the site," said Colonel Zhao of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. "They report nothing unusual beyond evidence of a localized explosion, which your own colleague apparently caused." "Kent sacrificed himself to buy us time," Dr. Frost said, her voice tight with emotion. "But the thermal charge wouldn't have been enough to destroy the facility. At best, it collapsed some of the access tunnels." "If such a facility ever existed," interjected Dr. Schultz, the coalition's senior scientific advisor, who had been particularly vocal in his disbelief. Dr. Hernandez, who had been silent throughout most of the debriefing, suddenly stood. "I've had enough of this," she said, her voice uncharacteristically sharp. "While we sit here debating the reality of what we experienced, something is happening in Antarctica that will affect the entire planet." She approached the large display screen at the front of the room and connected her tablet. "I've been analyzing the markings we found in the ice tunnels, the human-made ones, and cross-referencing them with ancient writing systems. The screen filled with images of the pictographs we had discovered, alongside comparative examples from various archaeological sites around the world. These symbols match patterns found in some of the oldest human settlements, sites in Göbekli Tepe, pre-dynastic Egypt, and the Indus Valley. They tell a consistent story across cultures separated by vast distances. She highlighted specific images. These depict beings from the stars who came to Earth and established facilities beneath the ice. They conducted experiments on early humans and other species, creating hybrid entities to serve them. But eventually there was conflict, a war between humans and these visitors. "And you expect us to believe that prehistoric humans fought an interstellar war?" General Williams asked incredulously. "Not interstellar," Dr. Hernandez corrected. "The visitors were already here, established in facilities like the one we found. And the humans didn't win through superior technology. They won through numbers, sacrifice, and a weapon they discovered or developed specifically to combat these entities." She displayed more images, primitive drawings of humans wielding what appeared to be devices that emitted some kind of energy or radiation. Whatever this weapon was, it allowed our ancestors to disable the facilities and force the surviving visitors into hibernation or retreat. They then sealed the entrances and established a warning system, ritual practices, and oral traditions designed to keep future generations away from these sites. "Myths," Dr. Schultz scoffed. "You're basing your conclusions on prehistoric myths." "Myths often have foundations in historical events," Dr. Hernandez countered. "And these particular myths appear across cultures that had no known contact with each other, all telling the same essential story about beings from beyond who sought to control or change humanity." Before the debate could continue, an aide entered the conference room and whispered something to General Williams. His expression changed from skepticism to concern. "We just received a report from the Antarctic monitoring station at McMurdo," he announced to the room. "They're detecting unusual thermal anomalies and seismic activity throughout the eastern ice shelf. The patterns are consistent with large-scale melting from below." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. "It's happening faster than we anticipated," Dr. Lin said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The facility must have multiple energy sources that survived Kent's explosion." Colonel Zhao was already on his secure phone, issuing rapid commands in Chinese. The other military representatives followed suit, the room filling with urgent conversations in multiple languages. "We need immediate satellite coverage," General Williams ordered, "and prepare a joint military response team for deployment to Antarctica. Conventional weapons won't be effective against the technology we encountered," I warned. "We need to focus on finding whatever our ancestors used, the weapon Dr. Hernandez identified in the historical record." "And where exactly would we find a prehistoric superweapon that may or may not have ever existed?" Dr. Schultz asked. Dr. Hernandez was already scrolling through her data. "Based on the symbolic connections, I believe examples or descriptions of the weapon might be found in certain archaeological sites, particularly those with restricted access or unusual security measures." "You mean classified sites?" General Williams asked. His interest suddenly piqued. "Possibly," she replied. "There are locations around the world where archaeological research is limited or prohibited entirely, ostensibly for preservation purposes, but perhaps for other reasons." The general nodded slowly. "I may be able to facilitate access to certain repositories of unusual artifacts that various governments have collected over the years." "In the meantime," I said, "we need to establish a quarantine zone around the Antarctic site. Nothing should be allowed in or out until we understand exactly what we're dealing with." For the first time since our return, I saw genuine concern replace skepticism in the faces of those around the table. The satellite imagery now displaying on the main screen showed thermal anomalies spreading across the Antarctic ice sheet, hotspots that corresponded to the layout of the facility as we had mapped it. "How much time do we have?" Colonel Zhao asked. Dr. Lin studied the thermal patterns. "At the current rate of ice melt, perhaps 2 weeks before the main chambers are exposed. Less if the process accelerates." "Which it will," Dr. Frost added grimly. The system was designed to adapt and optimize itself. General Williams stood, his decision made. Dr. Harper, your team will work with our scientific advisors to locate this potential weapon. Dr. Hernandez, you'll have whatever resources you need for your archaeological research. The rest of us will prepare containment and response strategies. As the meeting disbanded, each person rushing to their assigned tasks, I found myself standing alone at the window, looking out at the peaceful Lake Geneva. The contrast between the serenity of the view and the horror of what was awakening in Antarctica was almost unbearable. Dr. Hernandez joined me, her tablet still clutched in her hand. "There's something I didn't mention in there," she said quietly, ensuring no one else could hear. "What is it?" "The ancient accounts, they don't just describe a conflict between humans and these visitors. They speak of a cycle, of repeated awakenings and battles throughout human history. You're saying this has happened before, since prehistoric times?" She nodded. "According to the texts, approximately every 10,000 years, the facilities activate and the visitors return. Each time, humanity has managed to drive them back, but at tremendous cost. Entire civilizations have fallen in these conflicts. Which means others have stood where we're standing now," I said, the weight of the realization settling over me. "Made the same decisions we're making." "Yes," she agreed. "And whatever weapon they used, it wasn't a permanent solution, just enough to buy time until the next cycle." I thought of the countdown we had witnessed in the facility, of the signal sent to distant stars. But this time might be different. We may have triggered a premature awakening. The visitors, the masters, may not be prepared for their return. Which could work in our favor, Dr. Hernandez suggested, or make them more dangerous, more desperate. As we stood there contemplating the battle to come, I couldn't help but wonder about those ancient humans who had faced this threat before us. Had they felt the same mixture of dread and determination? Had they understood what they were fighting for? One thing was certain. We were now part of a conflict that had shaped human history from the shadows, a war most people didn't even know was being waged. And the next chapter in that ancient struggle was about to begin, beneath the ice of Antarctica. The military transport plane shuddered as it descended through turbulent Antarctic winds. Through the small window, I watched the vast expanse of ice grow closer. The same pristine landscape that had concealed unimaginable horrors beneath its surface. 1 month had passed since our warning had finally been heeded. In that time, the situation had deteriorated far beyond our worst predictions. The thermal anomalies had expanded exponentially, creating a melt zone nearly 50 kilometers in diameter. Satellite imagery showed strange structures beginning to emerge from the ice, not just the facility we had discovered, but others scattered across the continent in a pattern that suggested deliberate placement. Most disturbing were the reports from the initial reconnaissance teams. Those that returned described encounters with entities matching our descriptions of the facility's inhabitants, creatures that had begun to venture onto the surface, apparently adapting to the harsh Antarctic environment with alarming speed. Many teams didn't return at all. The international response had been massive but chaotic. A joint military force had established a perimeter around the primary melt zone, but maintaining it proved nearly impossible as the ice continued to recede and shift. Scientific teams worked around the clock to understand what was happening, while political leaders struggled to keep the situation contained, both physically and in terms of public knowledge. Dr. Hernandez's research had yielded results far beyond what anyone had expected. Working with archaeological teams and classified government archives from around the world, she had pieced together a more complete picture of humanity's previous encounters with the Antarctic entities. The weapon our ancestors had used wasn't a device in the conventional sense, but a substance, a compound that affected the visitor's biology in ways that our primitive ancestors couldn't have understood but had discovered through desperate trial and error. The compound had been preserved in various forms across multiple cultures, in temple vaults, in tomb offerings, in sacred vessels guarded by generations of keepers who may not have fully understood what they were protecting, but knew it was vital to humanity's survival. Analysis of samples from these various sources had revealed a complex organic molecule unlike anything in modern science. Something that Dr. Lin described as anti-evolutionary, a compound that specifically targeted and reversed the genetic modifications the visitors had engineered into themselves and their servants. Synthesizing it had required technologies that didn't exist a month ago, hybrid systems combining the most advanced human science with reverse-engineered principles from the limited data we had recovered from the facility. Now, as our plane landed on the hastily constructed airstrip at the edge of the quarantine zone, I carried with me a container holding what might be humanity's only hope, enough of the synthesized compound to theoretically neutralize the emerging threat. Theoretically. The scene that greeted us as we disembarked was one of organized chaos. Military vehicles and personnel moved in carefully coordinated patterns around a forward operating base that hadn't existed weeks ago. Scientific equipment sat alongside weapons emplacements, researchers in thermal gear working alongside soldiers in cold weather combat uniforms. General Williams met us at the edge of the airstrip, his face grim beneath his cold weather hood. "Situation's deteriorating," he said without preamble. "We lost contact with Forward Post 3 6 hours ago. Satellite shows the main structure is now 70% exposed." "And the entities?" I asked. "Increasing in number and variety. The ones matching your maintenance descriptions are the most common, but we've encountered larger types. Combatants, we're calling them. They've begun probing our perimeter, testing our defenses." Dr. Lin examined the latest thermal imaging on a tablet the general provided. "The energy signatures are intensifying," he observed. "The core is nearly at full capacity." "What about the signal?" Dr. Hernandez asked. "Any indication it's been received?" The general hesitated. "Our deep space monitoring has detected something. Anomalous readings in the outer solar system. Whatever it is, it's moving toward Earth." The implication sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the Antarctic cold. "How long?" "At current velocity, less than a week." Dr. Frost, who had been overseeing the final stages of the compound's synthesis, checked the secure container I carried. "The deployment system is ready. We've modified thermal charges to disperse the compound as an aerosol throughout the facility's ventilation system. But someone has to get close enough to plant them," I noted. "A team is being assembled," General Williams said. "Special forces operators from multiple nations, equipped with the best protective gear we could develop based on your descriptions of the entity's capabilities. I'm going with them," I stated. Not a request, but a declaration. "Dr. Harper, that's not necessary," the general began. "I've been inside. I know the layout, the potential access points. And I've encountered these creatures before. Your operators haven't." After a moment, Williams nodded. "The team deploys in 3 hours. Get whatever rest you can before then." As the others moved toward the briefing area, Dr. Hernandez pulled me aside. "James, there's something else you should know. Something I found in the oldest accounts, but didn't include in the official reports." "Why not?" "Because it might be nothing but mysticism, or it might be vital. The ancient texts suggest that the compound alone isn't enough. They describe a resonance, a specific frequency that amplifies its effect. Like a catalyst? More like a trigger. The compound disrupts their biology, but the frequency activates it, makes it spread from one entity to another. And this frequency, do we know what it is?" She hesitated. "Not exactly. The descriptions are metaphorical, couched in religious terminology. They speak of the voice that unmakes, of the sound that returns the change to their true nature." "Not much to go on," I said. "No, but there's more. The texts suggest that humans who had been experimented on by the visitors, who carried some of their genetic material, could somehow generate or channel this frequency. They were considered sacred, protected. Are you saying we need some kind of hybrid human alien to make this work?" "I'm saying that the compound alone might not be enough. We should be prepared for that possibility." Before I could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the base. The ground beneath us trembled. Not the subtle vibrations we had felt in the facility, but a violent shaking that knocked equipment over and sent personnel stumbling. "They're breaking through!" someone shouted. From beyond the perimeter came a sound I recognized all too well, the high-pitched shriek of the maintenance creatures, but amplified 100-fold, as if thousands were calling at once. Through the swirling snow, I saw shapes moving toward the base, too many to count, their elongated limbs propelling them across the ice with unnatural speed. Behind them rose larger forms, the combatants General Williams had mentioned, heavily armored and carrying what could only be weapons. The base's defenses engaged immediately, automated turrets firing high-caliber rounds, soldiers taking positions behind barricades, aircraft scrambling for close air support. But for every entity that fell, 3 more emerged from the ice. "We need to move now," I shouted to General Williams. "If we wait, there won't be a base left to launch from." The general barked orders into his comm unit, and within minutes, a transport helicopter was powering up at the edge of the landing zone. The Special Forces team, 12 operators from 6 different nations, was already boarding, their specialized gear making them look more like deep-sea divers than soldiers. I secured the container of the compound and ran toward the helicopter, Dr. Hernandez following close behind. "What are you doing?" I asked as she climbed aboard. "Coming with you," she replied. "If we need to figure out this frequency, you'll need someone who understands the historical context." There was no time to argue. The helicopter lifted off as the perimeter defenses began to fail, the entities overwhelming them through sheer numbers. Below us, I could see the base being overrun, personnel fighting desperately or fleeing toward secondary positions. But my attention was drawn to what lay beyond, the fully exposed facility, no longer hidden beneath the ice. It was vaster than I had imagined, extending for kilometers in all directions, its black, light-absorbing material a stark contrast to the white landscape. And at its center, where the energy core was located, a column of blue light now shot skyward. A beacon reaching into the atmosphere and beyond, a signal, a welcome, a declaration that Earth was once again open for its master's return. The helicopter approached the facility from the east, flying low to avoid detection. The plan was to insert our team near one of the ventilation shafts we had identified from thermal imaging, access points that might allow us to reach the core without navigating the main chambers where the entities were concentrated. As we neared the insertion point, one of the operators, a Norwegian Special Forces soldier who had introduced himself simply as Eriksson, handed me a weapon unlike any I had seen before. "Developed based on your team's reports," he explained, "sonic disruptor. The creature's sensory systems are vulnerable to specific frequencies. This won't kill them, but it might disorient them long enough for you to get away." I accepted the weapon, hoping we wouldn't need to test its effectiveness. The helicopter hovered just long enough for us to fast rope down to the surface, then immediately pulled away, retreating to a safe distance where it would await our extraction signal, if we survived to send one. The ventilation shaft was exactly where the thermal imaging had indicated, a circular opening approximately 2 meters in diameter, leading straight down into the facility. Unlike the carefully crafted entrance we had originally discovered, this was clearly designed for function rather than access, with no signs of the intricate craftsmanship that characterized the main chambers. 2 operators secured the perimeter while the others prepared the descent equipment. Within minutes, we were rappelling down the shaft, into darkness broken only by our helmet lights. The shaft descended for nearly 100 meters before opening into what appeared to be a maintenance tunnel, narrow, utilitarian, and mercifully empty of entities. The air was warm and humid, carrying the same strange, alien scent I remembered from our previous exploration. Eriksson consulted a holographic display projected from his wrist unit. "The core should be approximately 500 meters in that direction," he said, pointing down the tunnel. "We'll place charges at 100-meter intervals to ensure dispersal throughout the ventilation system." We moved forward cautiously, every sense alert for signs of the entities. The tunnel branched repeatedly, forming a complex network that serviced different sections of the facility. At each junction, we consulted the thermal mapping to determine which path would lead us closest to the core. After placing the first 2 charges, we began to encounter evidence of the entities, strange organic residues on the walls and floor, tools or devices left where they had been used, and occasionally the distant sounds of their clicking communication. At the 3rd charge placement point, one of the operators, a Chinese soldier named Lieutenant Zhao, detected movement ahead. We immediately doused our lights and activated the thermal imaging in our visors. The display showed 3 maintenance entities moving through an intersecting tunnel, apparently unaware of our presence. They paused at a junction, manipulating something on the wall, perhaps a control panel, before continuing on their way. "They're increasing air circulation," Dr. Lin whispered, observing their actions. "Preparing the environment." We waited until they were well clear before proceeding, placing the 3rd charge and continuing toward the core. The tunnels became warmer as we progressed, the humidity increasing to near tropical levels. At the 4th charge location, just 200 meters from the core according to our mapping, we encountered a problem. The tunnel ahead had collapsed, recently, judging by the debris. The explosion Kent had triggered must have damaged this section. "We need to find another route," Erickson said, consulting his display. "There's an alternative path, but it takes us through one of the main chambers." It was a significant risk. The main chambers were where the entities would be concentrated, preparing for their master's arrival. But we had no choice. The remaining charges needed to be placed closer to the core to ensure the compound would reach all critical systems. We backtracked to a previous junction and took an ascending passage that led to a higher level of the facility. This section was familiar to me, part of the network of chambers we had explored during our original expedition. As we emerged into one of the larger chambers, we immediately pressed ourselves against the walls, seeking cover behind equipment and structural elements. The space was occupied by dozens of entities, both maintenance types and the larger combatants, all engaged in what appeared to be preparation activities. In the center of the chamber stood one of the terminals we had seen before, displaying the same 3-dimensional map of Earth with multiple locations highlighted. The entities moved around it in coordinated patterns, their movements precise and purposeful. "We need to cross to the far side," Erickson whispered, indicating a passage on the opposite side of the chamber. "It's the only way to reach the core ventilation system." The distance was approximately 50 meters, 50 meters of exposed space filled with entities that would immediately detect any human presence. "Diversion," suggested one of the American operators, reaching for an item on his tactical vest. "No," I countered. "Any explosion or obvious distraction will bring more of them. We need something subtler." Dr. Hernandez, who had been studying the entity's movements, pointed to a control panel near our position. "That appears to regulate the chamber's environmental systems. If we could alter the temperature or humidity suddenly, it might draw their attention long enough for us to cross." Dr. Lin examined the panel. "I can trigger a maintenance cycle. It would create condensation on the upper surfaces. Nothing catastrophic, but it might distract them momentarily." It was our best option. Lin carefully manipulated the controls while the rest of us prepared to move. When he gave the signal, we would have seconds at most to cross the chamber undetected. "Ready," Lin whispered, his finger poised over the final control. "On my mark. Now." He activated the sequence. Immediately, a fine mist began to form near the ceiling of the chamber, droplets of moisture condensing on the upper surfaces. As predicted, the entities reacted, their attention drawn upward as they assessed the unexpected environmental change. We moved as one, keeping low and using the chamber's equipment as cover wherever possible. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain the entities would hear it, but their focus remained on the condensation above. We had almost reached the far passage when disaster struck. One of the operators, a Russian whose name I hadn't caught, lost his footing on the now slick floor. He didn't fall, but his equipment shifted, creating a metallic sound that cut through the ambient noise of the chamber. The nearest entity's head snapped in our direction, its sensory pits dilating as it detected our presence. It emitted the high-pitched shriek that I remembered all too well, alerting the others. "Run!" Erickson ordered, abandoning stealth. We sprinted for the passage, even as the entities converged on our position with terrifying speed. The Special Forces operators took defensive positions, their weapons, conventional firearms modified with specialized ammunition, firing in controlled bursts that dropped the closest pursuers. But there were too many. For every entity that fell, 3 more took its place, swarming toward us in a tide of elongated limbs and chitinous bodies. We reached the passage, Erickson and 2 others remaining at the entrance to hold off the entities, while the rest of us continued toward the core. The sounds of combat echoed behind us as we ran, the passage sloping downward toward our objective. The 5th charge was placed at a junction where multiple ventilation shafts converged, a critical distribution point that would ensure the compound reached throughout the lower levels of the facility. But we still needed to place the final charge as close to the core as possible. The passage ended at a familiar sight, the walkway encircling the energy core, the massive column of blue energy now pulsing with blinding intensity. Unlike during our previous visit, the surrounding chambers were filled with entities of all types, engaged in what appeared to be a frenzy of activity. And there, at the main interface we had discovered earlier, stood a figure different from any entity we had encountered before. Taller, more proportionate, its features more defined, it resembled the commanding entity that had spoken to us, but somehow more complete. "The welcome party," Dr. Hernandez whispered. "It's preparing to receive the masters." We needed to place the final charge at the main ventilation intake near the core's base, a point that would distribute the compound throughout the entire facility in minutes. But doing so would require crossing the walkway in full view of hundreds of entities. "We need another diversion," I said, "something big enough to draw all their attention." Dr. Lin studied the energy core, his expression thoughtful. "The core is operating at maximum capacity. If we could create a surge in one section, it would trigger automatic containment protocols. Every entity in the facility would respond." "How do we create a surge?" asked one of the remaining operators. Lin pointed to a distribution node on the far side of the walkway. "Overloading that junction would do it, but someone would have to reach it and manually initiate the overload." "A suicide mission," the operator said quietly. "I'll do it," Dr. Hernandez said suddenly. All eyes turned to her in surprise. "The rest of you focus on placing the final charge. I can reach the junction." "Claudia, no," I protested. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," she replied with a certainty that brooked no argument. "And there's something else, something I didn't tell you before. The frequency, the catalyst that activates the compound. I think I know what it is." "How?" She smiled sadly. "Because I've been hearing it in my head since we first entered the facility. At first, I thought it was just stress, imagination, but it's been growing stronger, more defined. I don't understand." "My DNA, James. When they ran the tests after our return, there were anomalies they couldn't explain, markers that didn't match any known human genetic sequence. The realization hit me with stunning force." "You're saying you carry their genetic material? How is that possible?" "I don't know. Perhaps an ancestor was one of their experiments generations ago. Or perhaps I was exposed to something during our first expedition that altered my DNA. But I know the frequency now. I can generate it." Before I could respond, the decision was made for us. The entities below had detected our presence, alerted by the movements of their companions in the chambers we had passed through. They began to swarm toward the walkway, climbing the support structures with inhuman agility. "Go!" Dr. Hernandez shouted, already moving toward the distribution node. "Place the charge. I'll create the diversion." The remaining operators and I ran in the opposite direction, toward the main ventilation intake. Behind us, I heard the sounds of combat as Hernandez used the sonic disruptor to clear a path to her objective. We reached the intake, a massive circular opening at the base of the core, drawing air from throughout the facility to cool the energy generation systems. The final charge was larger than the others, containing the bulk of the synthesized compound. As the operator secured it in place, I looked back to see Dr. Hernandez reach the distribution node. Entities surrounded her, but she moved with a strange new confidence, as if guided by something beyond her own instincts. She accessed the node controls and began a sequence of inputs, her movements precise and unhesitating. The entities around her suddenly paused, as if confused by her actions. actions that mimicked their own patterns too perfectly to be human. The command entity near the main interface noticed what was happening and issued a series of sharp clicks. The entities surrounding Hernandez moved to stop her, but it was too late. She completed the sequence, and then, to my horror, placed her hands directly into the energy conduit that fed the node. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Energy surged through the node, causing cascading overloads throughout the distribution system. Alarms, the same resonant tones we had heard during our first expedition, sounded throughout the facility. Every entity turned its attention to the core, moving to contain the crisis, as they had been programmed to do. In the momentary confusion, we activated the final charge, initiating the dispersal sequence that would release the compound into the ventilation system. But Hernandez wasn't finished. As energy coursed through her body, she began to emit a sound, not vocal, but somehow projecting from her entire being. It was a frequency I felt rather than heard, a vibration that seemed to resonate with the very structure of reality. The command entity froze, its body convulsing as if in pain. The other entities near Hernandez began to react similarly, their movements becoming erratic, uncoordinated. "The catalyst," Dr. Lin whispered in awe. "She's generating the frequency." The compound began to disperse from the charges, visible as a fine mist that quickly spread through the ventilation system. As it reached the entities affected by Hernandez's frequency, something extraordinary happened. Their bodies began to change, the elongated limbs contracting, the extra joints dissolving, the chitinous coverings sloughing off to reveal something underneath that appeared almost human. The transformation spread from entity to entity, a wave of change that swept through the facility as the compound was distributed by the ventilation system, activated by the frequency Hernandez continued to generate, despite the energy coursing through her body. The command entity fought against the change longer than the others, its form fluctuating between alien and humanoid as it struggled to maintain control. But eventually, it too succumbed, collapsing to the floor as its body reconfigured into something that might have walked the earth thousands of years ago. Throughout the facility, the same transformation was occurring, entities reverting to their original forms, the genetic modifications that had adapted them for their specific functions unraveling under the compound's influence. Dr. Hernandez remained at the distribution node, her body now glowing with the same blue energy that powered the core. She turned toward me, her eyes meeting mine across the distance. "Tell them," she called, her voice carrying despite the chaos around us. "Tell them what was done to our ancestors. Tell them what might be done again." Before I could respond, the energy surged once more, enveloping her completely. There was a flash of blinding light, and when my vision cleared, she was gone, integrated into the energy system of the facility itself. The core's pulsations began to slow, the column of blue light diminishing in intensity. The beacon that had been projecting into space flickered and died, the signal to the approaching masters cut off. Around us, the transformed entities lay unconscious or disoriented, their bodies now recognizably human-like, though still bearing features that marked them as something different, something engineered long ago by visitors from beyond our world. "We need to evacuate," Erickson said, checking his tactical display. "The facility's power systems are becoming unstable. Without the entities to maintain them, they're beginning to fail." We made our way back through the facility, encountering no resistance from the transformed entities, most of whom seemed confused, lost, like amnesiacs awakening in unfamiliar surroundings. Some of the Special Forces operators suggested eliminating them, but I refused. They weren't the enemy anymore. They were victims, perhaps the descendants of humans taken and modified by the visitors millennia ago, their true nature hidden even from themselves. We reached the surface as the facility began to collapse, the ice around it cracking and shifting as the once stable structure lost integrity. The helicopter was waiting at the designated extraction point, having monitored our progress through the operator's tracking systems. As we lifted off, I looked back at what remained of the facility, now just a dark depression in the ice, slowly being reclaimed by the Antarctic environment. Somewhere down there, Claudia Hernandez had sacrificed herself to save humanity from a threat most people would never know existed. The compound had worked. This time. The signal had been cut off, for now. But the approaching masters were still out there, still coming, even if their welcome party had been disbanded. And there were other facilities, other caches of technology and knowledge hidden beneath the ice, waiting to be discovered or reactivated. The war wasn't over. Perhaps it never would be. Just as the ancient texts had suggested, a cycle of conflict that had shaped human history from the shadows. But we had won this battle, bought time for the next generation to prepare, to advance, to be ready when the visitors inevitably returned. As the helicopter carried us away from the continent that had nearly become humanity's downfall, I recorded this account. A warning for those who would come after us, a testament to what we had discovered and what we had lost. The symbols on the wall aren't human. I know that now. Whatever made them had fingers or appendages far too long and numerous to be one of us. I'm recording this because I don't think any of us will make it back to the surface. If you're hearing this, don't send anyone else. Seal the entrance. Forget we were ever here. But of course, you won't forget. You can't forget. Because the threat remains, sleeping beneath the ice, waiting for the next awakening. And when it comes, will humanity be ready?
Back in 2015, my wife Iris and I, along with our friends Jake and Tabby, had been planning this hiking trip for many weeks. We all worked together at Westlake Publishing, a small but demanding firm where vacation time was as rare as winter sunshine in Seattle. I was a senior editor handling our nonfiction titles. Iris managed our digital marketing, Jake worked in accounting, and Tabby led our design team. Our schedules rarely aligned, making this opportunity almost miraculous. "I can't believe we actually pulled this off," I said during our weekly planning lunch. The four of us had squeezed into our usual corner booth at the cafe across from our office building. 3 consecutive days without a single deadline, Iris added, her eyes bright with anticipation. At 34, she maintained the enthusiasm of someone a decade younger, which was one of the countless reasons I'd fallen in love with her. Jake, always the practical one, spread a detailed trail map across the table. "The Morrison Ridge has some of the most spectacular views in the state. We'll start here." He traced a blue line with his finger, "and follow this trail to Crescent Lake. If we push ourselves, we might even make it to the summit overlook." "I've already packed all the emergency supplies," Tabby interrupted, brushing her copper hair away from her face. "First aid kit, flares, water purification tablets." "And I've got the good whiskey," Jake added with a grin. The plan was to head out early Saturday morning and spend the entire day exploring the wilderness. We'd camp overnight and return Sunday evening, giving ourselves Monday to recover before diving back into our professional lives on Tuesday. It was the perfect escape, or so we thought. In the days leading up to our trip, we obsessively checked weather forecasts. Spring in the Pacific Northwest was notoriously unpredictable, but every report promised clear skies and mild temperatures. I remember feeling an unusual sense of optimism as I packed my hiking gear the night before. Iris and I moved around our bedroom in comfortable silence, our excitement palpable without needing words. "Do you think we should bring extra socks?" Iris asked, holding up 2 pairs. "Always," I replied, thinking about the many stories I'd edited about hikers who suffered because they'd neglected such simple precautions. That night, I slept restlessly, my mind racing with anticipation rather than fear. If only I'd known what awaited us on Morrison Ridge, I might never have closed my eyes again. We'd mapped out a trail that promised stunning views, and we were all eager to disconnect from the world. Jake had even suggested we leave our phones behind, but Tabby, ever the voice of reason, insisted we bring them for emergencies, a decision that would later prove crucial. The drive to the trailhead was peaceful. The sun was just starting to rise, casting the entire landscape in a magnificent orange glow. We were laughing, swapping stories, and enjoying the early start. I distinctly remember Iris singing along to the radio, her voice merging with the melody in a way that made my heart swell. Jake and Tabby were in the back seat, debating the merits of various hiking boots. Everything felt perfect, suspended in that golden moment between anticipation and experience. Weather report said clear skies all day, Jake mentioned as we turned onto the gravel road leading to the trailhead. We couldn't have picked a better weekend. The parking area was empty when we arrived, another good sign. We'd have the trail to ourselves, away from the weekend warriors and tourist groups that often crowded popular hiking spots. I pulled into a space near the trailhead sign and killed the engine. "First one's here," I announced, feeling a strange pride in our early arrival. But as soon as we stepped out of the SUV, our excitement took a devastating hit. The sky darkened almost instantly, as if someone had drawn a heavy curtain across the sun. Within minutes, it started to downpour with such intensity that visibility dropped to mere feet in front of us. "What the hell?" Jake shouted over the sudden roar of rain. "This wasn't in the forecast!" The rain hammered against our bodies with unusual force. It wasn't just rain. It was as though the sky had split open and unleashed its full fury upon us. We scrambled back into the vehicle, slamming doors and gasping from the shocking transition. "It was clear literally 30 seconds ago," Tabby said, wiping water from her face. "This is insane." We hoped it was just a passing shower and decided to wait it out in the car. We'd already made the 2-hour drive. Turning around wasn't an option we wanted to consider. The rain pounded against the roof and the windows fogged up with our breath. Water streamed down the glass in sheets, distorting the outside world into a blurry, shapeless void. "Should we check the radar?" Iris suggested, pulling out her phone only to find we had no service. "Great. No signal." Jake leaned forward from the back seat, his expression unusually serious. "You know, there's a reason they call this part of the mountain range the Weather Maker. Local legend says storms can form out of nowhere." "Thanks for mentioning that now," I replied, trying to keep my tone light despite a growing unease. After about 20 minutes, the rain mysteriously let up, leaving behind a misty, overcast landscape that bore little resemblance to the sunny morning we'd driven through. The trees dripped steadily, and the trail had transformed into a muddy stream. We debated whether we should continue the hike. The weather had shifted so dramatically that it seemed foolish to proceed, yet we'd been planning this escape for months. The trail was still calling us, and we didn't want to waste our precious time off. "We're already here," Jake said, adjusting his backpack. "A little rain never hurt anyone." "That wasn't a little rain," Tabby countered, "and the trail conditions will be terrible." Iris caught my eye, and I could read her thoughts perfectly. We needed this break, this adventure, regardless of the conditions. We spent our days indoors, editing manuscripts and attending meetings. This was our chance to experience something real, even if that reality was wet and muddy. "We came prepared for bad weather," I said finally. "Let's give it a try. We can always turn back if it gets worse." With unanimous, if tentative, agreement, we grabbed our gear and headed out. The air felt unusually heavy, saturated with moisture that clung to our skin. The forest around us had transformed. What should have been a vibrant green woodland was now a shadowy labyrinth of dripping trees and swirling mist. We'd barely made it a quarter mile up the trail when the rain started again, this time even harder than before. It was like someone had turned on a faucet directly above us, and we were drenched within seconds. "This is ridiculous!" Iris shouted over the deafening downpour. We turned back, running toward the parking lot, laughing and cursing simultaneously, trying to shield ourselves from the relentless water. The trail had become treacherous, with slick mud threatening to take our feet out from under us at every step. By the time the car came into view through the curtain of rain, we were soaked to our skin, our clothes heavy and clinging uncomfortably. But as we reached the car, we saw something that made us all stop in our tracks. Standing next to our SUV was a young woman. She was soaked to the bone, her clothes clinging to her thin frame like rags. She looked as though she had been through hell. Her hair was matted against her skull, and her face was covered with what appeared to be dirt or mud. At first, I thought perhaps I was seeing things because of the rain, but no. She was definitely real and standing directly next to my car. Even more unsettling was that she appeared to be looking into the windows. Without thinking, I shouted, "Hey, get away from my car!" It was more out of fear than anger, an instinctive response to a situation that felt inherently wrong. I felt a rush of adrenaline surge through my body, every instinct warning me that something wasn't right. She didn't move. She stood there staring at us with hollow eyes that seemed to look through rather than at us. Her gaze reminded me of photographs I'd seen of shell-shocked soldiers, present in body but absent in mind. Before I could shout again, Iris grabbed my arm. "Wait," she whispered urgently. "She looks hurt." Jake and Tabby remained silent behind us, uncertain how to respond. I didn't want to let this stranger into our car, but I couldn't ignore the possibility that she might be in serious trouble. What if she'd been attacked? What if she was running from someone? The moral implications of leaving her in this deluge were impossible to dismiss. Against my better judgment, we approached her cautiously. Up close, I could see that her lips had a bluish tint, suggesting hypothermia might be setting in. Her clothes were inappropriate for hiking, thin cotton rather than moisture-wicking materials, and she wore canvas shoes instead of boots. "Are you okay?" Iris asked gently. "Do you need help?" The woman's eyes finally focused, but her expression remained unsettlingly blank. When she spoke, her voice was raspy, as though unused for days. "Car broke down, miles back. Been walking." "Where were you headed?" Jake asked, stepping forward. She didn't answer directly. "Just need to get somewhere warm." An internal debate raged within me. Every crime documentary I'd ever watched screamed caution, yet my humanitarian instincts couldn't ignore someone in distress. I made a decision I would later regret with every fiber of my being. "We can give you a ride to the nearest town," I offered. We all piled into the SUV with the woman sitting behind the front passenger seat. Iris positioned herself in the middle seat of the back, trying to comfort this stranger. The car felt immediately cramped, windows fogging up again from the sudden influx of bodies. The tension was suffocating. What had begun as a fun hiking trip had transformed into something entirely different and increasingly disturbing. The woman didn't speak. She just sat there, shivering and staring straight ahead with unfocused eyes. Iris, always the empathetic one, worried aloud that she might be in shock. The stranger had makeup running down her cheeks, creating dark rivulets that made it impossible to determine whether they resulted from rain or tears. "What's your name?" Tabby asked, turning in her seat to face our unexpected passenger. No response. "Where exactly did your car break down?" Jake tried. Again, silence. I kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, attempting to read her expressions, but there was nothing there, just a vacant stare. Her eyes were open, but nothing seemed to register. It was as if her body was present while her mind remained elsewhere. The rain continued its assault on the vehicle, creating a constant drumming that filled the uncomfortable silence. I turned on the heater, hoping to combat the chill that had settled over all of us, but especially our mysterious passenger. Jake leaned forward from his seat. "We should get her to the nearest gas station and call for help," he suggested in a low voice. We all agreed. There was no cell service in this remote area, so that was our best option. I started the car and began navigating the muddy road. The windshield wipers worked frantically to maintain visibility, but the deluge was overwhelming. The road had transformed into a river of mud, making steering precarious. Every few seconds, I felt the wheels lose traction, causing my knuckles to whiten as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Something still wasn't sitting right with me. It wasn't just the tension of the situation. It was everything about this woman. The way she had appeared out of nowhere, her complete silence, the way she didn't seem affected by the cold or rain in the way a normal person would be. It was clear she had issues, but it was impossible to determine whether she was dangerous or genuinely traumatized. I could sense my wife and friends trying to maintain calm, but the discomfort was evident, especially in Tabby. She kept her body pressed against the passenger door, maximizing the distance between herself and the stranger. Jake maintained a forced conversational tone, periodically attempting to elicit some response from our passenger, but his questions evaporated into the tense atmosphere without acknowledgement. The nearest gas station was about 15 minutes away under normal conditions. In this weather, with the roads deteriorating by the minute, I estimated it would take us closer to 25. I tried to focus solely on driving, but my mind kept circling back to the woman. Who was she? What was she doing out here alone? Why wouldn't she speak? We were about 2 minutes from the gas station when everything changed. The woman, who had been completely silent for the entire journey, suddenly started to scream. It wasn't an ordinary scream. It was a loud, high-pitched, guttural sound that startled me so violently that I momentarily lost control of the vehicle. She began thrashing around in the back seat, striking the windows and seats with unexpected strength. Iris tried to calm her, but the woman's movements became increasingly erratic and violent. I struggled to keep the SUV on the road, but the combination of the slick conditions and the chaos behind me made it nearly impossible. "What's happening?" Tabby shrieked, pressing herself against the door. "Hold her down!" Jake shouted to Iris, unbuckling his seatbelt to help. But it was too late. The car veered off the road and into a ditch with a sickening lurch. The impact wasn't severe. We'd been traveling at reduced speed due to the conditions, but it was enough to throw us all forward against our seatbelts. The engine stalled, and for a moment, everything was silent except for the relentless pounding of rain against the metal roof. We were all breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. I had a minor scrape on my forehead from hitting the steering wheel, but a quick assessment suggested everyone else was physically unharmed. Then the woman began to laugh. It started as a low chuckle before escalating into full-blown hysterics. It was a cold, empty laugh that sent involuntary shivers through my body. She wasn't hurt or scared, she was amused. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Jake shouted at her, his face contorted with anger and fear. The woman's insane laughter came to an abrupt end. With movements too quick to counter, she pulled out a small blade from inside her shirt, a box cutter with the metal edge extended. She drove her left elbow into Iris's neck, pinning my wife against the seat, while simultaneously holding the blade to Tabby's throat. "Give me all your money now," she demanded, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. The most unsettling aspect of this nightmare was the complete absence of fear in her voice. There was only a sick satisfaction, as though she'd executed this scenario countless times before. Her eyes, previously vacant, now gleamed with a predatory intensity that made my stomach turn. We didn't argue. We emptied our wallets, handing over cash, credit cards, and anything else of value. Iris was crying silently, tears streaming down her face. Jake was cursing under his breath, and I was desperately trying to maintain composure, knowing that any sudden movement could result in disaster. The woman grabbed the money and valuables, stuffing everything into her pockets. Then, without warning, she threw open the car door and sprinted into the rain without looking back. We sat in stunned silence, the back door hanging open, rain pouring in. After several seconds of shocked immobility, I finally managed to restart the car. Iris closed the door, her hands visibly trembling, and I carefully backed out of the ditch. Nobody spoke as we drove the remaining distance to the gas station. What could we possibly say? We'd been manipulated, threatened, and robbed by someone we tried to help. The gas station attendant looked alarmed when we stumbled in, soaked and visibly shaken. He immediately called the police while offering us towels and hot coffee. The small convenience store, with its fluorescent lighting and mundane products, seemed surreally normal after what we'd just experienced. When the sheriff arrived, he took our statements with a practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd heard such a story. "You folks aren't the first to get taken in by her," he said, closing his notebook. "We've had reports of a woman matching this description pulling similar stunts throughout the county for months now." "Why haven't you caught her?" Jake demanded, his hand still shaking as he clutched his coffee cup. The sheriff sighed. "Limited resources, vast wilderness. She knows these mountains better than my deputies. Disappears like smoke." "She could have killed us," Tabby said quietly, voicing the thought that had been circling in all our minds. "But she didn't," the sheriff noted. "Never does. Takes what she wants and vanishes. We think she might be living off the grid somewhere up in the northern section of the forest." As we provided descriptions and details, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd encountered something more disturbing than a simple robbery. The woman's behavior, her initial catatonia followed by manic violence, suggested deeper psychological issues than mere criminality. "Is she mentally ill?" Iris asked hesitantly. The sheriff's expression darkened. "We have reason to believe she might have escaped from Pinewood Psychiatric Facility about 8 months ago. Patient went missing during a transfer. Records sealed, so we can't be certain, but the timing matches." This revelation sent a new wave of horror through me. We hadn't just encountered a desperate person or ordinary criminal. We'd been at the mercy of someone potentially suffering from severe psychological disturbance, someone unpredictable and untethered from normal human constraints. By the time we finished with the police, the rain had finally stopped. We stood in the gas station parking lot, surveying our mud-splattered vehicle. The hiking trip was obviously over, but the decision to return home immediately was unanimous and unspoken. The drive back was subdued. Occasional attempts at conversation died quickly, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I kept replaying the events, analyzing each moment and decision that had led us to this point. Should I have trusted my initial instinct and kept driving? Could we have helped her without putting ourselves at risk? The questions multiplied without resolution. To this day, I have no idea who that woman truly was or where she came from. In the weeks following our encounter, I obsessively researched crimes in the area, scouring local newspapers and online reports for any information. I found scattered accounts of similar incidents. Hikers and campers reporting a strange woman who appeared distressed before robbing them, but nothing that provided closure. The sheriff called once to inform us they'd found our credit cards discarded along a remote forest road, but there was no further progress in the investigation. Eventually, like most unsolved cases in rural areas, it faded from official priority. But it never faded from my mind. The immediate aftermath was predictable: nightmares, jumpiness, a newfound suspicion of strangers. Iris and I installed a comprehensive security system in our home. Jake started carrying pepper spray. Tabby began seeing a therapist to process the trauma. We all developed new routines and precautions, accommodations to fear that gradually became normal. What lingered most persistently wasn't the robbery itself, but the psychological violation. We had extended compassion and received calculated malice in return. That exchange fundamentally altered how I viewed humanity. 6 months after the incident, we received an unexpected call from the sheriff's department. They'd found a makeshift campsite deep in the national forest that they believed belonged to our attacker. Among the scattered possessions was a notebook containing detailed accounts of numerous robberies, including ours. The entries were disturbing. Clinical descriptions devoid of emotion, as though documenting scientific experiments rather than crimes against fellow humans. The woman herself remained at large, a ghost haunting the wilderness and the darker corners of my mind. Sometimes when it rains heavily, I find myself staring out windows, half expecting to see her standing there, watching me with those empty eyes. I imagine her still out there, targeting other Good Samaritans, exploiting human kindness for her survival. We never attempted that hiking trip again. In fact, we've never returned to that part of the state. The wilderness, once a source of rejuvenation and escape, now represents vulnerability and threat. I recognize the irrationality of this response, the statistical improbability of encountering her again. But fear rarely respects statistics. All I know is that we were lucky to escape with our lives. Even though we emerged physically unharmed, the experience fundamentally altered our perception of safety and trust. It makes me physically ill to think that somewhere out there, that wild-eyed woman is most likely terrorizing someone else, manipulating their compassion before revealing the predator beneath the victim's disguise. I've come to understand that the most terrifying monsters aren't supernatural creatures lurking in shadows. They're the humans who walk among us, wearing masks of normalcy or vulnerability until the moment they choose to reveal their true nature. And that revelation, that sudden transformation from victim to victimizer, contains a horror more profound than any ghost story. Because while you can dismiss ghosts as fiction, there's no denying the very real predators who prey on human kindness. They exist. I met one, and I survive with the knowledge that kindness, that most human of virtues, can sometimes lead us directly into danger. I found the first footprints on a Tuesday. They weren't mine, too narrow, with a distinct tread pattern I'd never seen before. They circled my cabin, stopping beneath each window, lingering near the back door where the lock was weakest. But I should start from the beginning. My name is Mark Henderson, and what I'm about to tell you happened back in the summer of 2002, when I was living off the grid in a makeshift cabin near Lake Lure, North Carolina. I'd moved there after years of city life, craving quiet days and no landlords breathing down my neck. I'd built a small shack out of old plywood and scavenged beams right off a dirt path about a half-mile from the water's edge. You wouldn't call it fancy, but it was enough for me. A cot, a table, a wood-burning stove, and a few tools I had picked up cheap from a flea market in Asheville. I'd grown up in Baltimore with too many people telling me what to do. Here, I figured I could just be myself, catch my own fish, grow a few vegetables, and get some peace. Most folks around Lake Lure found me odd, but friendly enough. I'd even learned to make simple jokes about my scraggly beard and the way my clothes never fit right. I like to say I dressed from the reject bin of Goodwill, and that got a laugh more than once. I was comfortable being the weird guy down the road who minded his own business. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The forest's constant whisper had become as natural to me as my own breathing. Each morning, I'd wake to dappled sunlight filtering through the single window above my cot, dust motes dancing in the beams. The floorboards creaked with familiar voices, each one a friend I'd come to know during long winter nights when the temperature dropped low enough to make the wood contract and settle. I spent my days hauling water from a nearby spring, chopping wood, checking my tomato plants, and trying to keep my radio antenna straight so I could catch a few stations at night. The place was thick with pines and oaks, and in the morning, I'd hear distant boat motors hum on the lake. Every now and then, I'd see a tourist couple passing on the gravel track, sometimes waving, sometimes just hurrying past as if unsure about me. My routine was simple but fulfilling. I'd wake at dawn, stoke the embers in my stove, and boil water for coffee. The first gulp always burned my tongue, but I welcomed the sensation, a reminder that I was alive, present in my body. I'd check my small garden plot, pulling weeds and inspecting the vegetables for signs of deer or rabbit intrusion. By midday, I'd hike to the lake, spending hours with my fishing line cast into the clear water. Some days I caught nothing. Other days I'd fry up bass or trout over an open flame, the sizzle of fish skin against hot metal a symphony to my ears. I liked being off-grid because it spared me the awkward small talk, but I still had my moments of chat with some locals. There was a guy named Ray Sanchez who worked at jobs fixing docks and fences, and he'd stop by on his ATV once in a while, trading a beer for a few fresh tomatoes. He was about my age, had a sunburned neck and a slow, comforting drawl. I liked him enough. He never pried into why I lived alone, and I never asked him too many questions either. "Man's got a right to his privacy," Ray told me once, tipping his beer in a salute. "You ain't hurting nobody out here?" That comment stayed with me. Before Lake Lure, my life had been a series of cramped apartments, meaningless jobs, and relationships that collapsed under their own weight. Out here, I found a certain peace in the stillness, in the absence of expectations. But solitude has its price. The human mind isn't built for complete isolation. After a few months alone, I started talking to myself. Quiet mutterings at first, then full conversations. I'd debate politics with an empty chair, or describe my day to the squirrels that darted through my yard. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I'd wake with the distinct feeling someone had called my name. Maybe that's why I ignored the first signs. Maybe I was so accustomed to the tricks of a lonely mind that I dismissed the evidence right in front of me. It began with small things. A cooking pot moved from its hook. My axe found 10 yards from where I last placed it. Footprints in the soft earth that vanished into the tree line. I rationalized each instance. I must have moved the pot and forgotten. The axe could have fallen and rolled. The footprints were probably my own from days earlier. One hot afternoon in late July, I was clearing brush, sweat soaking through my shirt, when I spotted something unmistakable behind my shack near the tree line. A set of footprints that definitely didn't match my boots. Someone had been creeping around while I was away. I crouched down, ran my fingertips over the dry leaves, and checked the pattern. The soles were thin, maybe athletic shoes, and whoever it was had stepped carefully, avoiding the patches of mud that would have left clearer impressions. I followed the tracks as far as I could. They circled my cabin entirely, stopping at each window, lingering at the back door with its flimsy padlock. The thought of someone watching me, studying my home while I was gone, sent a chill down my back, despite the summer heat. At first, I figured it was just some hiker or a curious teen. The lake attracted plenty of tourists in summer, and some of them wandered off the marked trails. Perhaps someone had stumbled upon my cabin and, finding it empty, decided to investigate. An innocent explanation. But as twilight thickened into darkness that night, I found myself checking the lock twice, then 3 times. I pushed my single chair against the door handle for good measure. The woods had never seemed threatening before. They were my sanctuary, my escape from the world's chaos. Now, as the wind rustled through the pines and something small scurried beneath the cabin floor, I felt exposed, vulnerable. I tried to dismiss the unease as I settled onto my cot, the springs groaning beneath my weight. The radio picked up nothing but static that night, a harsh white noise that filled the cabin like fog. I switched it off and lay in darkness, listening to the forest's nighttime chorus. Crickets, frogs, the occasional hoot of an owl. Just as sleep began to tug at my consciousness, a twig snapped outside. Clear and sharp, close to my window. My eyes flew open, and I held my breath, straining to hear more. For several minutes, nothing. Then the subtle crunch of leaves under careful footsteps, moving slowly around the perimeter of my cabin. Someone was out there, deliberately circling my home in the darkness. I reached under my cot and grabbed the hunting knife I kept there, its wooden handle smooth and reassuring in my palm. The footsteps paused outside my window, and I could sense someone standing there, perhaps peering through the glass at my still form. I remained motionless, knife clutched to my chest, heart hammering so loudly I was certain whoever stood outside must hear it. Minutes stretched like hours. Eventually, the footsteps retreated, fading into the forest's ambient sounds until I couldn't distinguish them anymore. I didn't sleep that night. I sat upright on my cot, knife in hand, watching the square of window gradually lighten as dawn approached. When morning finally came, I searched the area around my cabin. The footprints were clearer now, definitely not mine. Smaller, narrower, with a distinct tread pattern. They had indeed circled my entire cabin, stopping at each window, spending extra time at the back door where my lock was weakest. As I stood in the clearing, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, a new feeling settled in my chest. A cold certainty that something had changed. My sanctuary had been violated. The solitude I'd cherished now felt ominous, pregnant with threat. I was no longer alone in these woods. As the days rolled on, I started feeling like I had eyes on me constantly. The sensation would creep up my spine while I worked in my garden or collected firewood, that unmistakable awareness of being watched. I'd spin around, searching the forest's edge, but never caught more than a shadow slipping between trees, there and gone so quickly I questioned if I'd seen anything at all. At night, I'd hear twigs snapping outside. Sometimes a branch would scrape against my window, too deliberate to be the wind. I took to sleeping with my hunting knife under my pillow and the hatchet beside my cot. Sleep became shallow, fractured by every sound from the darkness outside. A week after finding those first footprints, I discovered my fishing gear missing. I kept my rod, tackle box, and a few handmade lures on the small covered porch. The first time they disappeared, I cursed at my own forgetfulness, thinking I'd left them at the lake or moved them inside and forgotten. I spent hours retracing my steps, searching every corner of my cabin, convinced I'd simply misplaced them. But the next morning, the gear was back on the porch, arranged exactly as I always kept it, except the line on my reel had been cut and retied with knots I never used, and one of my favorite lures was missing. Someone had taken my things, used them, and returned them deliberately altered. The second time my fishing gear vanished, I knew someone was messing with me. This time, only the tackle box disappeared. 3 days later, I found it hanging from a tree branch 30 yards into the forest. Several hooks removed, and the rest rearranged in perfect rows, grouped by size and type with an obsessive precision I found more disturbing than if they'd been destroyed. That afternoon, Ray stopped by on his ATV, the engine's rumble a welcome intrusion on the heavy silence that had settled around my cabin. He sat on a stump outside my shack, sipping a warm can of beer I'd traded him for some fresh squash. When I told him about the missing gear and the footprints, his expression changed, the easy smile disappearing from his sun-weathered face. "You ever see this guy?" he asked, his tone serious. He had a habit of rubbing the back of his neck when he was nervous, and he did it right then. I shook my head. Just shadows, footprints, things moved or taken. Ray looked toward the woods, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the tree line. I heard rumors, he said quietly, about some fellow roaming around here. Not sure who he is, but folks seen him near old campsites. What kind of rumors? I pressed, leaning forward. Ray took a long pull from his beer, then crushed the can in his fist. Bad ones. Campers reported stuff missing. Food, clothes, hunting knives. Park ranger found a campsite all torn up a few weeks back, blood on the ground. No body, though. You think it's the same person? Can't say. Ray looked uneasy, which put me on edge. Just be careful, Mark. This ain't normal mischief. He finished his beer and stood to leave, brushing pine needles from his jeans. I'm heading up north to my cousin's cabin this weekend, coming back Tuesday. You need anything from town before I go? I shook my head, though what I really needed was the reassurance that I wasn't alone out here with whoever, was stalking the woods. Ray promised he'd come back in a few days, maybe bring his old shotgun for me to borrow. I didn't sleep easy that night. I wedged a piece of scrap metal into my front door to reinforce the latch. My heart beat a little faster than usual when I blew out my lantern. There was this feeling, like being watched from deep among the trees. I couldn't see anyone, but I heard soft movement at odd hours, the careful placement of feet trying to avoid dry leaves, the controlled breathing of someone accustomed to moving undetected. Morning brought no relief. The air felt thick with tension as I stepped onto my porch, scanning the clearing for signs of intrusion. Nothing seemed disturbed at first glance. I made coffee with water I'd boiled the night before, sipping it slowly as I walked the perimeter of my property, searching for new tracks. Near the woodpile behind my cabin, I found something that made my coffee mug slip from my fingers, shattering on the rocky ground. A knife was stuck into a log stump, driven deep into the wood with considerable force. It wasn't mine. The blade looked homemade, maybe hammered out of a file or something. The handle was wrapped in electrical tape, worn smooth in places from extensive use. I approached slowly, as if the knife might suddenly animate and fly at me. The morning sun caught the edge of the blade, revealing a dark, rust-colored stain along its length. I told myself it was just corrosion, but the way it flaked off at my touch suggested otherwise. I pulled it free, the wood releasing it with reluctance. The knife felt wrong in my hand, balanced for someone else's grip, the handle too narrow for my fingers. I walked to the edge of my clearing, stared into the dense pine forest, and threw the knife as hard as I could. It tumbled end over end, disappearing into a thicket with a quiet rustle. As it landed, I caught a glimpse of movement through the branches. A tall man, shirtless, lean, and sunburned, with a shaved head and a twisted scar that ran from his right ear down to his collarbone. He wore track pants and old sneakers, his bare chest marked with strange, self-inflicted scars, rows of small parallel lines that couldn't have been accidental. He looked right at me, didn't blink, then slipped silently behind a tree. My first instinct was to run after him, to confront this intruder who'd been terrorizing me. But something in his eyes, a hollow emptiness, devoid of emotion, stopped me. I felt too stunned and honestly a bit scared. This wasn't a curious hiker or mischievous local. The way he moved, fluid and silent, reminded me of a predator. I retreated to my cabin, barricaded the door, and spent the day jumping at every sound from the forest. By evening, a plan had formed in my mind. I needed to speak with Ray again, to learn what else he knew about this stranger. Ray's cabin was about 15 minutes away by foot, closer to the main road. He wouldn't be back from his cousin's place until Tuesday, but maybe he'd left something behind, a newspaper clipping, a note, any information that might help me understand what I was dealing with. As twilight settled over the trees, I gathered my courage and ventured out. The forest took on an ominous quality in the fading light, shadows deepening into perfect hiding places for watching eyes. I moved quickly, following the narrow trail that connected our properties, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I reached the small clearing where Ray's cabin stood, something felt wrong immediately. His ATV sat flipped on its side behind the structure, one wheel still spinning slowly. The door to his cabin hung open, swaying slightly in the evening breeze. "Ray?" I called out, approaching cautiously. No answer. The silence felt heavy, unnatural. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I stepped onto the porch, wood creaking beneath my weight. "Ray, you home early?" I pushed the door wider and the smell hit me first. A sharp, metallic odor like iron and something else, something organic and wrong. My eyes took a moment to adjust to the dimness inside. Ray lay face down on the rough-hewn floorboards, one arm outstretched toward the back door, as if he'd been trying to escape. Blood pooled around his neck, soaking into the wood, already turning dark and tacky. My mouth went dry, and my legs turned weak as I processed what I was seeing. I reached down, fingers trembling as I touched his wrist, checking for a pulse I knew wouldn't be there. His skin had already cooled. His throat had been cut, a single deep slash that had nearly severed his head from his body. The wound was precise, executed with practiced efficiency. I backed away, gagging, and stumbled outside, my heart hammering against my ribs. The reality of my situation crashed down on me. Ray was dead, murdered by the same scarred stranger who'd been circling my cabin for days. I had no phone, no way to call for help. The nearest neighbor might be miles away, and I wasn't even sure they'd have a phone. As I stood on Ray's porch, paralyzed by indecision, movement caught my eye at the forest's edge. A pale figure watching me from between the trees. Even at this distance, I could see his eyes, flat, emotionless, studying me with cold calculation. He didn't try to hide. He wanted me to see him, to know he was there. The stranger raised one hand, pointing directly at me. Then he drew a single finger across his throat in a slashing motion. The message couldn't have been clearer. I ran. Blind panic propelled me through the forest, branches whipping my face as I crashed through underbrush, following no path, driven only by the primal need to put distance between myself and the killer. I had no direction, no plan beyond escape, my mind flooded with images of Ray's body and the stranger's cold, predatory gaze. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to stop. I leaned against a massive oak, lungs burning, legs trembling with fatigue. The forest had grown dark around me, the last light of day fading rapidly. I had no idea where I was. The familiar landmarks were gone, and in my panic, I'd veered off any trail. As my breathing slowed, rational thought began to return. Running blindly through the woods at night was suicide. I needed shelter, weapons, and a plan. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to think. My cabin was safer than the open forest. At least there I had walls, a door that locked, and my hunting knife. I oriented myself using the North Star and began the careful journey back, moving as quietly as possible, stopping frequently to listen for pursuit. Every shadow seemed to harbor the scarred man, every rustle of leaves his footsteps. The journey took twice as long as it should have, my progress slowed by caution and the need to remain silent. When I finally reached the edge of my clearing, I paused, studying my cabin from the darkness of the tree line. It appeared undisturbed, the windows dark, the door still closed. But that meant nothing. He could be inside, waiting for me. I circled the property slowly, checking for signs of intrusion. The scrap metal still wedged the door shut from the inside. He hadn't entered that way. The windows remained latched. Only after a complete circuit did I approach, slipping through the door quickly and securing it behind me. Inside, I lit a single candle, keeping it low to avoid broadcasting my presence through the windows. By its flickering light, I took inventory of my situation. I had my hunting knife, a hatchet for chopping wood, some rope, matches, a canteen of water, and a small amount of food. Dried beans, jerky, and a few potatoes. Not much to sustain me, but enough for a day or two. I knew I had to leave. Ray's murder confirmed what I'd suspected. The scarred man was dangerous, possibly deranged. If he'd killed Ray, he'd have no hesitation about doing the same to me. My isolated cabin, once a sanctuary, had become a trap. The main road was about a mile away, a long exposed walk through dark woods where he clearly knew the terrain better than I did. But staying meant certain death. At least on the road, I might flag down a passing vehicle, find help at one of the tourist cabins that dotted the lakeshore. I spent that night in a state of hypervigilance, knife in hand, back against the wall, watching the door and windows for any sign of the killer. Every creak of the cabin's timbers, every whisper of wind through the pine needles outside sent adrenaline surging through my veins. Sleep was impossible. By first light, I'd made my decision. I would leave at dusk when the fading light might provide some cover, but still allow me to see my way. Moving during full daylight seemed too exposed, too obvious. I spent the day preparing, packing a small bag with essentials, hiding a few emergency supplies in my clothing, and planning my route to the main road. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across my clearing, I made final preparations. I sharpened my knife, secured the hatchet to my belt, and filled my canteen. The weight of the blade against my palm offered some comfort, though I harbored no illusions about my chances against a practiced killer. I wrote a quick note explaining what had happened, naming Ray and describing the scarred man, then tucked it into a tin can and buried it beneath my woodpile. If things went badly, perhaps someone would eventually find it. When twilight finally arrived, I stepped onto my porch for what I knew might be the last time. The forest had taken on that hushed quality peculiar to dusk, when diurnal creatures have settled and nocturnal ones have yet to emerge. A perfect, dangerous silence. I took one last look at my cabin. The rough walls I'd built with my own hands, the garden plot where tomatoes still ripened on the vine, the stump where I'd sat so many evenings watching the sunset through the trees. For all its simplicity, this place had been mine, a home I'd created from nothing. Now I was abandoning it, fleeing like a hunted animal. The path to the main road wasn't direct. I would need to follow a narrow dirt track for about half a mile, keeping a small ridge to my right, then cut across a shallow creek before hitting the wider gravel road that served the lakeside properties. In daylight, an easy walk. In growing darkness, with a killer in the woods, a gauntlet. I moved carefully, placing each foot deliberately to minimize noise. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches reaching like grasping hands, shadows deepening with each passing minute. Every few yards, I stopped to listen, turning in a slow circle to check my surroundings. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against my back. The first quarter mile passed without incident. I began to hope, foolishly perhaps, that the scarred man had moved on to easier prey. Maybe Ray's death had satisfied whatever twisted hunger drove him. Maybe I could reach the road, find help, return with armed authorities to reclaim my home. Then I saw it. Something lying across the path ahead, visible only as a darker shadow against the ground. I approached cautiously, knife ready, every sense strained to detect danger. As I drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a horrifying tableau. It was a body, a camper I guessed from the hiking boots and outdoor clothing. A young woman, maybe in her 20s, with dark hair spread around her head like a halo. Her clothes were torn, and she was clearly dead, her glassy eyes staring sightlessly at the canopy of trees above. Her arms had deep defensive cuts, and she looked like she'd tried to fight back, her fingernails broken and bloody. I stood there, breathing hard, feeling sick. This killer was out of control, hunting the woods systematically. The woman couldn't have been dead long, hours at most. Her blood still glistened wetly in the fading light. I needed to move on, to reach help before darkness fell completely. But the sight of this stranger dead on the trail paralyzed me. I should cover her, I thought distantly. She deserved that dignity, at least. But as I reached for my pack to find something to serve as a shroud, I heard a rustling behind me. I whipped around and saw him stepping out from behind a cluster of pines, emerging from the shadows like he was part of them. The scarred man stood with unnatural stillness, watching me with those empty eyes. He didn't speak. His gaze moved from my face to the hunting knife in my hand, then to the dead woman on the ground, as if introducing me to his handiwork. He held a piece of metal in his right hand. Not a conventional knife, but something homemade, perhaps a sharpened file or a railroad spike hammered flat and honed to a cutting edge. Dried blood crusted its length. I gripped my hatchet tight with one hand and my hunting knife with the other, feeling sweat drip down my face despite the cooling evening air. I tried to speak, to ask why, to understand what drove him to such violence, but my throat felt full of sand, words impossible. He stepped closer, about 10 yards between us now. I took a step back, mind racing, trying to remember if there was any place nearby I could run to, any defensive position I could take. Nothing but trees and deepening darkness in every direction. "Why are you doing this?" I managed finally, my voice a rasp. The scarred man tilted his head slightly, regarding me with something like curiosity. His voice, when it came, surprised me. Soft, almost gentle, with an educated cadence I hadn't expected. "You don't belong here," he said simply. "None of you do." Then he ran at me without another word, closing the distance between us with frightening speed. Time seemed to slow as he charged. I saw details with unnatural clarity, the way his scar pulled his upper lip into a permanent sneer, the precise arrangement of self-inflicted markings across his chest, the focused intensity in his eyes. He moved with practiced efficiency, his makeshift weapon held low and angled for an upward thrust into my abdomen. I swung the hatchet up and managed to block his first strike. Metal clanged against metal, the impact sending painful vibrations up my arm. My shoulder burned as he tried to push me off balance, his lean frame belying surprising strength. I yelled, "Stop! Why are you doing this?" But he didn't answer, his face a mask of concentration. We struggled, locked together, his weapon pushing closer to my ribs as my strength began to falter. His breath came in controlled, even measures, while mine emerged in panicked gasps. This wasn't his first fight. He knew exactly what he was doing, conserving energy, waiting for the inevitable moment when my guard would drop. I kicked at his shin, connecting solidly, making him stumble for a second. In that brief window, I wrenched away, trying to create distance between us. He recovered quickly, lunging after me, slashing at my midsection with his sharpened spike. I twisted, and it nicked my shirt but missed flesh by millimeters. I felt panic flood my chest, the knowledge that he would eventually connect, that I couldn't maintain this desperate defense indefinitely. Somehow I managed to headbutt him, driving my forehead into the bridge of his nose. It hurt me almost as much as it hurt him, stars exploding behind my eyes, but he let go for a second, blood streaming from his nostrils. I didn't waste the opportunity. I darted off the trail, ducking under low branches, pushing through dense underbrush, trying to put distance between us. He followed immediately, his footsteps unnervingly quiet compared to my crashing progress through the forest. I could hear him snapping dry sticks underfoot, breathing steadily, unhurried. He knew these woods. He knew I had nowhere to go. After 100 yards or so, I stopped behind a thick oak trunk, pressing my back against the rough bark, holding my breath. My lungs burned for air, and my legs trembled with exhaustion and fear. I clutched my knife and hatchet with white-knuckled intensity, listening for his approach. He came into view moments later, moving with that predatory calm, scanning the area methodically. Blood still trickled from his nose, but he seemed unbothered by it, focused entirely on the hunt. I tried to stay absolutely still, not even blinking, aware that the slightest movement would give away my position. He took a few steps forward, then stopped, head tilted as if listening. His eyes swept past my hiding place once, then returned, narrowing slightly. A small smile curved his lips. He knew where I was. In that moment, I realized the futility of hiding. If I waited for him to pass, he might circle back or pick up my trail again. This would only end one way, with one of us dead in these woods. I decided to try something desperate, something he might not expect from frightened prey. I held my breath, counted to 3, and stepped out from behind the tree, swinging the hatchet as hard as I could at his forearm. I connected solidly, the blade biting deep into flesh and striking bone. He screamed, a high animal sound of pain and shock, and dropped his weapon, staggering backward. He turned toward me, eyes wide with a mixture of pain, hatred, and something else, surprise. I had become more than prey. I had become a threat. Before he could recover, I rammed into him with my shoulder, using my greater weight as an advantage. We crashed onto a carpet of pine needles, rolling in the dirt, each struggling for dominance. He tried to grab for his dropped blade with his uninjured hand, but I kicked it away and pinned his arm down, pressing the hatchet's wooden handle across his throat. He thrashed beneath me, bucking and twisting with desperate strength. I put my full weight into holding him down, feeling the sinews in my arms burn with the effort. He spat and cursed at me in a low, shaking voice, words tumbling out in a frenzied stream. "You're all the same," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Coming here, taking everything, destroying the quiet. I was here first. I was here before any of you." His words made no sense. Lake Lure had been settled for generations. The scarred man couldn't have been more than 35. But rationality had clearly abandoned him long ago, leaving only this feral creature clawing at my arms, drawing blood with his nails as he fought for freedom. I pressed harder, watching his face contort with rage, and then, gradually, fear. This was the first human emotion I'd seen in those dead eyes. The realization that he might lose this fight, that his reign of terror in these woods might end beneath the weight of a man he'd considered easy prey. "You don't have to do this," he gasped, changing tactics as his strength ebbed. "Let me go. I'll leave. You'll never see me again." "Like Ray?" I growled, pressing harder. "Like that girl on the trail? They never saw you again either." A strange light entered his eyes then. Not remorse, but a kind of pride. "They were weak," he whispered. "Not like you. You fought back. You're different." His words sent a chill through me, deeper than anything I'd felt before. This wasn't just a killer. This was something fundamentally broken, something that viewed human lives as nothing more than game pieces in some private hunt. I could see it now in his face, in the way he assessed me even as I choked the life from him. He was calculating, still planning, still certain he could win. I felt him weakening beneath me, his struggles becoming more desperate but less effective. His breath rattled in his throat, eyes bulging as his oxygen-starved brain began to fail. A part of me, the civilized part, the part that had lived in Baltimore and paid taxes and held doors for strangers, screamed to stop, to show mercy, to drag this man to authorities and let justice run its course. But another part, a deeper, more primal part, remembered Ray's severed throat. The young woman's sightless eyes, the knife left deliberately by my woodpile. The scarred man had forfeited mercy when he chose to hunt human beings for sport. His eyes rolled back. His body gave a final, shuddering convulsion. Then he stopped moving entirely. I waited a long moment before easing the pressure, my arms trembling with exhaustion and aftermath adrenaline. I bent down and felt for a pulse at his neck, finding nothing. The forest around us had gone completely silent, as if holding its breath. The whole thing felt surreal, dreamlike. I dropped my hatchet and sat back on my heels, panting. The scarred man lay sprawled in death, somehow smaller now, less menacing. In the fading twilight, he looked almost ordinary, just a lean, sunburned man with strange scars and empty eyes that would never hunt again. I remained there, crouched over his lifeless body, until my hands stopped shaking. The reality of what I'd done, taken a human life, even in self-defense, settled over me like a heavy cloak. I wasn't a killer. I'd come to these woods seeking peace, not violence. Yet here I was, with blood on my hands and a corpse at my feet. Eventually, I forced myself to stand. I gathered my knife and hatchet, found my bag where I dropped it, and took one last look at the scarred man. I should cover him, I thought distantly, just as I'd wanted to cover his victim. But I had nothing to offer, and truthfully, I couldn't bring myself to touch him again. Let the forest reclaim him. Let the animals have what he'd denied so many others. A natural end, a return to the earth. I started walking toward the main road again, leaving the killer behind. Each step away from that clearing felt both like escape and penance, my muscles protesting the continued movement after such extreme exertion. The forest around me seemed different now, still dangerous but no longer harboring the specific threat that had haunted my days and nights. As full darkness descended, I moved more carefully, using what little moonlight filtered through the canopy to guide my steps. My mind replayed the confrontation in endless loops, questioning every action, every decision. Could I have subdued him without killing? Should I have tried to run again? The questions had no answers, only the cold fact that I had survived and he had not. It took me a long time to get there, maybe hours. When I finally reached the gravel road, it was well past midnight, the moon high overhead casting silver light across the empty pavement. I walked along the shoulder, hoping to encounter another human being, someone who could help me make sense of the nightmare I'd just lived through. Eventually, headlights appeared around a bend, a pickup truck approaching slowly on the deserted road. I stepped into the path of the lights and waved my arms, aware of how I must look. clothes torn and dirty, blood-streaked arm, wild-eyed with exhaustion and trauma. The truck slowed and stopped. A couple in their 40s returning from some late fishing trip rolled down their window cautiously. The man leaned out, squinting at me in the darkness. "You okay, buddy?" he called, concern warring with caution in his voice. His wife clutched his arm, whispering something I couldn't hear. I must have looked like a madman, standing there in the headlights, swaying slightly with fatigue. "Please," I managed, my voice hoarse from disuse. "I need help. There's been a murder. Several murders." They exchanged a glance, then the man nodded and unlocked the doors. "Get in," he said simply. As I climbed into their truck, the warmth of the cabin and the faint country music from the radio struck me as absurdly normal, impossibly civilized after the primal violence of the forest. The woman handed me a bottle of water, which I drank greedily, my throat burning with relief. Between gulps, I managed to explain what had happened, stumbling over my words, feeling lightheaded and disconnected from reality. I told them about Ray, about the camper on the trail, about the scarred man and our final confrontation. I expected disbelief, suspicion, but they listened in silence, occasionally exchanging worried glances. "We need to get you to the sheriff," the man said finally, putting the truck in gear. "This is way beyond us." As we pulled away, heading toward town and authorities and the ordered world of law enforcement, I looked back at the dark line of trees receding behind us. Somewhere in that forest lay 3 bodies: Ray, the female camper, and the scarred man. 1 killer, 2 victims, and me, caught somewhere in between innocence and guilt. The truck's headlights carved a path through the darkness, and I leaned back against the seat, closing my eyes. I had survived. But I knew the forest, and the things I'd done there, would never release their hold on me. The Lake Lure Sheriff's Department occupied a small building off the main highway, its weathered brick facade and green metal roof unremarkable except for the cruisers parked in neat rows behind a chain-link fence. The couple, Jim and Diana Phillips, they'd introduced themselves during the drive, pulled into the gravel lot and killed the engine. The sudden silence felt heavy, expectant. "You want us to come in with you?" Jim asked, his weathered face creased with concern. I shook my head. "You've done enough." "Thank you." Diana reached across her husband and touched my arm gently. "You take care of yourself," she said, her voice soft with compassion. They waited until I'd entered the building before driving away, tail lights disappearing around the curve of the highway. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving glare. A young deputy sat behind a desk, filling out paperwork with mechanical precision. He looked up as I approached, eyes widening slightly at my appearance, clothes torn and filthy, dried blood on my hands and forearms, a wild, haunted look that I could feel radiating from my face. "Sir, you need some help?" he asked, standing slowly, one hand drifting toward his sidearm. The words came in a rush then, tumbling out in a disorganized stream. Ray's murder, the scarred man stalking me, the dead camper, our final confrontation in the woods. The deputy's expression shifted from wariness to alarm as I spoke. He called for his superior, and soon I found myself in a small interrogation room, a cup of bitter coffee cooling untouched before me as I repeated my story to Sheriff Morales, a heavy-set man with shrewd eyes and a carefully neutral expression. "So you're saying you killed this man in self-defense?" he summarized after I'd finished, making notes in a small leather-bound book. "Yes," I said, my voice hoarse from talking. "He attacked me. He'd already killed at least 2 people, maybe more." Sheriff Morales studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We'll need to verify your story, Mr. Henderson. Deputies Wilcox and Reyes will head out at first light to locate the bodies and gather evidence. In the meantime, I'm going to have to ask you to stay in town." I spent that night in a cell. Not arrested, the sheriff assured me, just detained for questioning. The narrow cot reminded me of my cabin's simple bed, but sleep remained elusive, chased away by visions of the scarred man's eyes as life drained from them. By sunrise, deputies had discovered Ray's body, confirming at least part of my story. By midday, they'd found the female camper, identified as Melissa Keller, a graduate student from Chapel Hill who'd been reported missing 3 days earlier. By evening, Guided by my description of the location, they'd recovered the scarred man's body as well. No identification on him, Sheriff Morales told me, sitting across from me in the same interrogation room. Fingerprints aren't in the system. Nobody knows who he is. What happens now? I asked, exhaustion evident in every syllable. Now we investigate, he replied simply. The medical examiner will perform autopsies. We'll collect evidence from the scenes. If your story checks out, and so far it seems to be, you'll be free to go. The deputies seemed reluctant to believe my story at first. I was, after all, a stranger who'd moved into the woods, built an illegal cabin on public land, and lived off the grid. But when they returned from investigating the sites, their demeanor changed. They'd found evidence that supported my account. Ray's severed throat, the defensive wounds on Melissa Keller's arms, and most tellingly, a cave about a mile from my cabin where the scarred man had apparently lived. Never seen anything like it, Deputy Wilcox told his colleague in hushed tones as they passed my cell. Trophies everywhere, hair, clothing, jewelry, all labeled with dates, some going back 3 years. Their words sent a chill through me. The man I'd killed hadn't just been a murderer. He'd been a serial killer, methodically stalking and murdering people in the woods around Lake Lure for years, collecting souvenirs from his victims. How many lives had ended at his hands before fate brought him to my doorstep? How many families were missing loved ones who would never return? 4 days after my arrival at the sheriff's department, I was officially cleared of any wrongdoing. The district attorney ruled the killing justified self-defense, based on the overwhelming evidence and the scarred man's history of violence. The medical examiner eventually identified him as Grant Phillips, a former wilderness guide who disappeared from a nearby county after being suspected in a domestic violence case. He'd been living in the woods for nearly 5 years, gradually descending into a murderous psychosis that saw tourists and locals alike as invaders in his territory. Sheriff Morales returned my hunting knife and hatchet, cleaned of blood and wrapped in brown paper. "These are yours," he said, sliding them across the table. "You're free to go, Mr. Henderson. Where will you head now?" The question struck me with unexpected force. I hadn't considered what came next. The thought of returning to my cabin, to the clearing where I'd first glimpsed the scarred man. Grant Phillips, I reminded myself, he had a name now, filled me with dread. The sanctuary I'd built had been irreparably violated. "I don't know," I admitted. The sheriff nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Take some time. Figure it out. The Lakeview Motel has a weekly rate if you need a place to stay temporarily." I left the sheriff's department that afternoon, stepping into sunlight that seemed too bright, too normal after the horror of the past week. The town of Lake Lure spread before me. Shops, restaurants, tourists strolling along the waterfront without any awareness of what had happened in the surrounding woods. Life continued, untouched by the violence that had consumed my world. I checked into the Lakeview Motel, a faded single-story building with peeling paint and clean rooms. The manager, a gray-haired woman named Eleanor, recognized me from the local newspaper. My story had made the front page, though thankfully without photographs. "You stay as long as you need," she told me, sliding a key across the counter. "First week's covered by the Victim Relief Fund." The room was small but comfortable, a clean bed, a shower with decent pressure, a television I didn't turn on. I stood under the hot water for nearly an hour that first night, trying to wash away not just the physical grime, but the memory of Grant Phillips's eyes, as he died beneath my hands. Over the following days, I found myself approached by locals who recognized me from the news stories. Some offered awkward thanks for stopping the killer who'd haunted their community. Others asked uncomfortable questions about the confrontation, seeking gory details I refused to provide. A few eyed me with suspicion, as if I might have brought this violence with me when I moved to their quiet town. Ray's funeral was held that Saturday at a small church near the lake. I attended, standing at the back, uncomfortable in borrowed clothes. His family, a sister from Raleigh, cousins from various parts of the state, didn't know me, but his sister approached after the service. "You were his friend," she said simply, not a question. "I was," I replied. "He mentioned you in his calls. The guy in the woods who traded vegetables for beer." A small, sad smile crossed her face. "Thank you for trying to help him." I nodded, unable to form words past the lump in my throat. I should have reached Ray sooner, should have recognized the danger earlier, should have prevented his death somehow. The weight of those should-haves pressed against my chest, making it difficult to breathe. I left Lake Lure the following week. I packed what little I had and caught a bus heading east. I never got to say goodbye to anyone there. Most folks didn't know me anyway. I just drifted away, carrying the memory of those nights and that scarred man with me. The bus wound through the mountains, putting distance between me and the nightmares that would follow me regardless of geography. Through the window, I watched pine forests give way to rolling hills, then to the coastal plain. I had no destination in mind, just away. Away from the cabin where I'd once sought peace. Away from the woods where I'd taken a life, even in self-defense. Sometimes I think about what I could have done differently. If I'd reported the footprints sooner. If I'd left at the first sign of trouble. If I'd insisted Ray stay with me instead of returning to his isolated cabin. But deep down I know I did what I had to do. I'm not proud of it. I just did what was necessary to survive. In the end, that's what it comes down to. Survival. Grant Phillips had surrendered his humanity to something primal and broken, hunting fellow humans through the forests he claimed as his exclusive territory. I'd gone to those same forests seeking escape, solitude, a simpler life. Instead, I found violence, terror, and a kind of knowledge about myself I never wanted. The certainty that, when pushed to the edge, I too could take a life. I don't live off the grid anymore. I found a small apartment in a coastal town, got a job at a hardware store, started rebuilding something resembling a normal life. I keep to myself mostly, but I'm not a hermit. I nod to neighbors, make small talk with customers, occasionally share a beer with coworkers after closing. But I still check the locks twice before bed. I still wake at the slightest sound in the night. And sometimes, in dreams, I'm back in those woods, with Grant Phillips's eyes locked on mine as the life drains from them. In those moments between sleep and waking, I wonder if I left something essential behind in that forest clearing. Some piece of my humanity that, once surrendered, can never be reclaimed. Perhaps that's the true cost of survival. Not just the trauma of violence experienced or inflicted, but the knowledge that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than we pretend. That under enough pressure, that line can disappear entirely. I live with that knowledge now. Carry it like a stone in my pocket, always there, always felt. And I wonder, in quiet moments, when the ocean breeze carries the scent of pine, if there might have been another way. I never considered myself easily frightened. Growing up in Oregon, I'd spent plenty of time hiking remote trails and camping in isolated areas. But what happened during my visit to Alaska in April 2021 fundamentally changed my perception of reality and my own sense of security. I've written this account not to sensationalize, but to document what occurred as accurately as possible. My mother had been working as a traveling nurse for nearly a decade, accepting 3-month assignments in areas with critical healthcare shortages. Her specialized skills in emergency medicine and trauma care took her to remote communities where medical professionals were scarce. That spring, she'd been stationed at Fairbanks Memorial Hospital, the primary healthcare facility serving interior Alaska's vast, sparsely populated region. "You should visit," she urged during our weekly video call in late March. "The northern lights have been incredible, and the spring thaw is beginning. It's beautiful here in a way I can't even describe." I'd been between freelance graphic design projects and was eager for a change of scenery. 3 days later, I boarded a flight to Fairbanks with plans to stay for 2 weeks. My mother had secured a modest 2-bedroom rental on the outskirts of town, its large windows facing north to capture the aurora displays that frequently painted the night sky in undulating greens and purples. "The hospital keeps me on 12-hour shifts," she explained after picking me up from the airport. "But I've arranged for 4 consecutive days off next week so we can explore together. Until then, you can use my car while I'm working." That first evening, we stood outside in the biting cold, watching ribbons of green light dance across the sky. Despite the temperatures hovering around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, I felt a profound sense of peace. The vastness of Alaska's landscape had an almost hypnotic effect. The enormous sky, the distant mountains, and the seemingly endless forests created an environment unlike anything I'd experienced. "It's different here," my mother said, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "The isolation. It changes your perspective." I couldn't have known then how prophetic her words would prove to be. My first few days in Fairbanks passed pleasantly as I explored the city and its surroundings. I visited the University of Alaska Museum of the North, wandered through downtown, and drove to nearby Chena Hot Springs where I soaked in steaming mineral waters while snow covered the ground around me. The juxtaposition was surreal, my body submerged in warmth while my face felt the sting of Arctic air. As I slowly acclimated to the environment, I began to appreciate the unique rhythm of life in interior Alaska. The locals moved with a deliberate purpose, their interactions marked by a blend of frontier practicality and unexpected warmth. At a coffee shop downtown, I struck up a conversation with an older man named Richard who had spent 60 years in the region. "You planning any day trips?" he asked, noticing my tourist map of Alaska spread across the table. "I'm thinking about driving down to Denali," I replied. "I'd love to see Mount McKinley." Richard's expression shifted slightly. "Denali Highway won't be fully open yet," he said, referring to the road that provides the closest access to the mountain during summer months. "And this time of year, the weather changes fast. If you go, make sure you've got emergency supplies and let someone know your route." He tapped a calloused finger on my map. "Folks don't realize how quickly you can find yourself completely alone out there. Cell service is spotty at best, and in April, we still get serious snowfall without much warning." His caution seemed reasonable but slightly overprotective until he added, "About 10 years back, a tourist couple drove out toward Healy in conditions similar to what we have now. Their car slid off the road in a sudden squall. When they didn't return to their hotel, search parties went out. Found their vehicle 3 days later, but never found them. The forest just swallowed them up." I thanked him for the advice and promised to be careful, but internally dismissed his concerns as the typical warnings locals give to tourists. I'd driven in snow before, and my mother's rental was a sturdy SUV with all-wheel drive and winter tires. That night, while my mother worked her overnight shift, I researched the route to Denali National Park. The George Parks Highway stretched 358 miles from Fairbanks to Anchorage, with the park entrance located about halfway between. Online reviews suggested the drive was manageable even in early spring, though services along the route would be limited during the off-season. I messaged my mother that I was considering making the trip while she worked her next shift. She responded quickly. "Beautiful drive, but very remote. Take water, food, blankets, full tank of gas. Check weather forecast before leaving." Her message echoed Richard's warnings, but my excitement about seeing North America's tallest peak overrode any hesitation. I prepared a small emergency kit with water bottles, protein bars, a blanket, and extra layers of clothing. I charged my phone fully and downloaded offline maps of the region. Tomorrow would be an adventure, my first real excursion into the Alaskan wilderness. I awoke early the next morning, pleased to see clear skies through the frost-rimmed windows. My mother had returned from her night shift and was sleeping soundly in her bedroom. I left a note on the kitchen counter with my intended route and estimated return time, then quietly slipped out to the car. The temperature display read 23 degrees Fahrenheit as I started the engine at 6:45 a.m. The roads in Fairbanks had been plowed, but patches of black ice gleamed in the early morning light. I navigated carefully through the quiet streets, stopping at a gas station to fill the tank and purchase coffee for the journey ahead. "Heading south?" asked the attendant as I paid, noticing my map and the emergency supplies visible in my back seat. "Yes, to Denali, hoping to see the mountain." "Good luck with that," he replied. "Cloud covers predicted later today. Mountain's shy this time of year. Shows herself maybe 1 day in 5. But the drive's worth it regardless." As I pulled onto the park's highway heading southwest out of Fairbanks, traffic was sparse. Occasional trucks passed in the opposite direction, their headlights still illuminated in the dim morning light. The landscape transformed quickly once I left the city limits. Dense spruce forests alternating with frozen marshlands, all set against a backdrop of distant snow-covered peaks. The road stretched before me like a black ribbon laid across an endless white canvas. For long stretches, no other vehicles appeared in either direction. The vastness and silence were both exhilarating and vaguely unsettling. I began to understand what Richard had meant about the isolation. Out here, you could truly disappear. I passed through Esther, a tiny community just outside Fairbanks, then continued on toward Nenana. The landscape became increasingly dramatic. Steep hills and valleys, frozen rivers, and glimpses of the Alaska Range appearing and disappearing as the road curved through the terrain. About an hour into my journey, I noticed the clear skies giving way to a thin layer of clouds moving in from the west. The temperature had dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit according to the car's display, and the wind had picked up, sending occasional flurries of loose snow across the highway. In Nenana, I stopped briefly to use the restroom at a small gas station that appeared to be the only business open in the tiny community. Inside, a few locals huddled around a coffee pot, their conversation halting momentarily as I entered. "Weather's turning," commented one man as I purchased a bottle of water. "You heading far?" "Denali," I replied. "Just for the day." He exchanged glances with his companions. "Keep an eye on those clouds, system moving in faster than they predicted." Back on the highway, I could see what he meant. The thin cloud layer had thickened, the bright morning sun now diffused into a pale glow. But the road remained clear, and my destination was still hours ahead. I pressed on, the SUV's heater keeping me comfortably warm as the temperatures outside continued to drop. After passing through the scattered buildings that constituted the community of Healy, the traffic became even scarcer. I drove for nearly 40 minutes without seeing another vehicle, the landscape growing more dramatic as I approached the outskirts of Denali National Park. The mountains loomed larger, their snow-covered peaks occasionally visible through breaks in the gathering clouds. By the time I reached the turnoff for the park entrance road, it was just after 11 a.m. A sign indicated that the road was closed beyond the park headquarters during winter months, and I realized my research had been insufficient. The famous Denali Park Road that provided summer visitors with close views of the mountain was inaccessible. At the visitor center, a dim, mostly closed facility with only a single ranger on duty, I learned that views of Mount McKinley from the park entrance were limited even in clear weather. The ranger suggested I continue south on the park's highway to an overlook near Byers Lake, where I might catch a glimpse of the mountain if the clouds cooperated. "It's about 20 miles further south," she explained, marking a spot on my map. "There's a turnoff for Byers Lake Campground. The campground itself is closed for the season, but the overlook is accessible. On a clear day, you can see the mountain from there." I thanked her and returned to my car, noticing that the clouds had continued to thicken. The bright day I'd departed in had transformed into a steel gray afternoon. Still, I'd driven this far. Another 20 miles seemed worth the chance to accomplish my goal. As I continued south on the highway, the transformation in the weather accelerated. The clouds lowered, enveloping the tops of the surrounding mountains and casting the landscape in an eerie, diffused light. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and occasional snowflakes began to drift across my windshield. The stretch of highway between the national park entrance and Byers Lake was perhaps the most isolated segment of my journey. I drove for nearly 30 minutes without passing another vehicle in either direction. The forest pressed close to the road on both sides, dense stands of black spruce and leafless aspen, their branches occasionally swaying in gusts of wind. My phone signal had disappeared shortly after leaving the park entrance. The screen displayed no service, leaving me completely disconnected. For the first time that day, a faint sense of unease crept into my thoughts. The isolation that had seemed so peaceful earlier now took on a more threatening quality. I spotted the sign for Byers Lake Campground just as heavier snow began to fall. The turnoff was partially obscured, with no indication that it led to a scenic viewpoint. A small wooden sign, its paint faded and peeling, displayed "Campground closed for season" in block letters. But there was no gate or barrier preventing entry, so I turned onto the narrow access road. The campground road was plowed but covered with a few inches of fresh powder that had accumulated since the last clearing. The SUV's tires crunched through the snow as I drove slowly into the deserted area. The road immediately split into several winding paths, creating what felt like a maze among the silent trees. I followed what appeared to be the main route, passing shuttered cabins and empty camping spots half buried in snow. The eerie silence was broken only by the sound of my engine and the increasing tap of snowflakes against the windshield. The wind had picked up, sending occasional swirls of powder across the road ahead. After several minutes of navigating the winding campground roads, I began to worry I had missed the overlook. I had seen no signs directing visitors to a viewpoint, and the gathering snowfall was reducing visibility. I considered turning back, but decided to press on just a bit further, hoping to find a clearing or elevated spot that might offer a view of the mountain. The road curved sharply, then descended toward what I realized must be the lake itself. As I rounded the final bend, the trees opened up to reveal a broad, white expanse, Byers Lake, completely frozen and covered with snow. Beyond it rose foothills, and beyond those, what should have been the Alaska Range and Mount McKinley. But the mountains were almost entirely obscured by low clouds and falling snow. I parked in a small clearing that appeared to serve as a summer boat launch. Despite the deteriorating weather, I felt compelled to step outside and at least take a photo of the lake. I zipped my orange jacket to my chin, pulled my green beanie down over my ears, and stepped out into the frigid air. The cold hit me with physical force, the temperature having dropped further since I'd left the highway. The wind carried ice crystals that stung my exposed skin as I walked toward the shore of the frozen lake. Fresh snow, about ankle deep, crunched beneath my boots. Standing at the edge of the vast white expanse, I experienced a momentary sense of awe that overcame my discomfort. The scene was hauntingly beautiful, the frozen lake stretching into the distance, surrounded by snow-laden trees and disappearing into the veil of falling snow. I pulled out my phone to take photos, though I doubted they would capture the raw, isolated beauty of the scene. As I stood there snapping pictures, a strange feeling began to creep over me. A subtle shift in the atmosphere that had nothing to do with the physical weather. It was as though the air had become charged with an invisible energy. The hairs on my arms rose beneath my layers of clothing, and an inexplicable sense of unease tightened my chest. I lowered my phone and scanned the surroundings, suddenly certain I was being watched. The forest edge around the lake appeared empty and still, the snow-covered trees revealing no movement. Yet the sensation persisted, growing stronger until it became almost unbearable. That's when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong in this empty wilderness. The scream cut through the silence like a blade. It was distinctly human, but somehow distorted, as though it were simultaneously close by and far away. The sound seemed to hang in the air for several seconds after it ended, reverberating in my mind long after the actual noise had ceased. I stood frozen, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. The rational part of my brain attempted to categorize the sound. Perhaps a wild animal, or the wind through a particular configuration of trees, or even my own imagination amplifying some natural occurrence. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that what I had heard was a human cry. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and ineffectual in the vast space. "Is someone there?" No response came except for the soft hiss of falling snow. I scanned the edges of the lake again, then turned to look back toward the campground. Nothing moved in the gray afternoon light. I was about to retreat to my car when movement caught my eye from across the lake. I squinted through the gently falling snow, focusing on the far shore perhaps a quarter-mile away. A figure stood at the edge of the tree line, partially obscured by the weather. From that distance, I could make out only general details. The person appeared to be wearing a light-colored jacket and what looked like a knit cap. They were standing perfectly still, seemingly looking in my direction. I raised my hand in a tentative wave, unsure if the person could even see me through the increasingly heavy snowfall. To my surprise, the figure immediately returned the gesture, raising their right arm in a mirror of my movement. Relief flooded through me. Another visitor, perhaps, someone else who had decided to explore this remote location despite the off-season closure. I was no longer alone in this isolated place, which somehow made the strange scream less threatening. But as I continued to watch the distant figure, my relief curdled into confusion, and then into a cold, creeping dread. The person across the lake was wearing an orange jacket, identical in shade to my own. As they shifted slightly, I could see what appeared to be blue jeans, also matching mine. And perched on their head was what looked unmistakably like a green beanie, exactly like the one I was wearing. I stood transfixed, trying to process what I was seeing. Could it be a coincidence? These weren't uncommon colors for winter clothing, but the combination, And in this deserted place, I took a step forward onto the frozen lake, straining to see more clearly. The figure mimicked my movement precisely, also taking a step forward. The synchronization sent a jolt of terror through me. As I stared, other details became apparent despite the distance and falling snow. The figure had my build, my height, and though I couldn't make out facial features clearly, something about the stance, the proportions, they were mine. Panic surged through me, accompanied by a profound sense of wrongness that defied rational explanation. Every instinct screamed for me to flee, yet I remained rooted in place, caught in a terrible fascination. The figure raised both arms slowly, extending them outward in a gesture that might have been beckoning or simply displaying itself to me. The movement broke my paralysis. I turned and ran back toward my car, my boots slipping in the fresh snow. The keys fumbled in my shaking hands as I reached the vehicle. I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure directly behind me, but the lakefront remained empty from my vantage point. Once inside the car, I locked the doors and started the engine with trembling fingers. The heater blasted cold air as I executed a hasty three-point turn on the narrow access road. Snow spun from beneath the tires as I accelerated back toward the campground entrance. In my rearview mirror, I could see only empty road and falling snow, yet the sensation of being pursued was overwhelming. My breaths came in short, painful gasps as I navigated the winding campground roads, taking wrong turns twice before finding the main access road. As I approached the campground entrance, a large white shape swooped across the road directly in front of my car. I swerved instinctively, nearly sliding into a snowbank. When I regained control and looked ahead, a snowy owl was perched atop the campground sign. Its head rotated at an unnatural angle as it stared directly at me. Its yellow eyes reflected my headlights with an eerie intelligence that sent another wave of irrational fear through me. I sped past the bird and back onto the park's highway, heading north toward Fairbanks with far more speed than was safe in the deteriorating conditions. The empty highway stretched before me, disappearing into swirling snow. I checked my rearview mirror obsessively, convinced I would see headlights following me, but the road behind remained empty. The journey back to Fairbanks passed in a blur of anxiety and adrenaline. The snow intensified as I drove north, reducing visibility and forcing me to slow despite my desperate desire to put as much distance as possible between myself and Byers Lake. The highway had become treacherous, with accumulating snow concealing patches of ice. I drove in a state of hyper-awareness, my senses painfully acute. Every shadow among the trees alongside the road seemed to contain movement. Every gust of wind that rocked the SUV triggered a spike of terror. The rational part of my mind knew I was experiencing some form of shock, but that awareness did nothing to calm my racing heart or ease my ragged breathing. About an hour into my return journey, I pulled into a roadside turnout to collect myself. I cut the engine but left the key in the ignition, the heater running to combat the intensifying cold. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached for my phone, desperately needing to connect with another human being. The screen still showed no service. I was completely alone with my fear. What had I seen? The question circled endlessly in my mind. There had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps another hiker had been wearing similar clothing. Perhaps the distance and weather had played tricks on my perception. Perhaps the isolation had affected my mental state more than I realized. Yet none of these explanations could account for the perfect synchronization of movement or the overwhelming sense of wrongness I'd experienced. The figure had been me, or something wearing my appearance with impossible precision. As I sat there trying to calm my breathing, a movement outside the passenger window caught my attention. I turned sharply, expecting to see nothing but swirling snow, but instead found myself staring at a face pressed against the glass. My own face. I screamed and lunged for the ignition in the same moment, the engine roaring to life as I slammed the SUV into drive. But when I looked again, there was nothing outside the window. No footprints in the fresh snow, no sign that anyone had approached the vehicle. My mind was fracturing. I couldn't trust my own perceptions anymore. I pulled back onto the highway, determined to reach Fairbanks without stopping again, regardless of the conditions. The next 2 hours passed in a nightmarish state of vigilance and fear. The snowstorm intensified, creating whiteout conditions that forced me to creep along at dangerous speeds. Twice, I nearly slid off the road when taking curves too quickly. The few vehicles I encountered loomed suddenly out of the swirling white, their headlights momentarily blinding me. By the time I crossed the Naniana River and approached Fairbanks, darkness had fallen completely. The storm had broken as I neared the city, the snowfall tapering to occasional flurries. Streetlights appeared ahead, their warm glow representing safety and sanity after hours of isolated terror. I pulled into the driveway of my mother's rental just after 7 p.m., having made what should have been a 3-hour return journey in just over 5 hours. My mother's car was gone. She had left for her evening shift at the hospital. I was simultaneously relieved to avoid immediate questions about my disheveled state and desperate for human contact. Inside, I double-locked the door behind me and methodically checked every room, turning on all the lights as I moved through the small house. Finding nothing out of place, I collapsed onto the living room sofa, still wearing my snow-covered boots and jacket. My body felt leaden with exhaustion, but my mind continued to race. I must have fallen into a fitful sleep because I woke with a start to the sound of a key in the front door. Daylight filtered through the windows. I had slept through the night on the couch. My mother entered, looking tired after her overnight shift. "What happened to you?" she asked immediately, taking in my disheveled appearance and the puddles of melted snow around my still-booted feet. I opened my mouth to explain, but found I couldn't articulate the experience. How could I describe what had happened without sounding mentally unstable? "Bad weather on the way back from Denali," I said finally. "Got caught in a snowstorm." She frowned, clearly sensing there was more to the story, but didn't press. "Well, you're safe now. That's what matters." The following days passed in a haze of restless sleep and persistent anxiety. I invented excuses to avoid leaving the house, spending hours researching possible explanations for what I had experienced. I scoured local news archives for stories of strange occurrences around Byers Lake, indigenous legends about the area, and scientific explanations for hallucinations triggered by isolation or extreme conditions. My search yielded little of substance. I found accounts of hikers becoming disoriented in the Alaskan wilderness, some with vague references to seeing things, but nothing that matched my specific experience. Indigenous Athabascan legends mentioned spirit beings that could assume human form, but these seemed firmly in the realm of mythology rather than useful explanations. On my third day back, while my mother was at work, I forced myself to visit the university library. In the Alaska and Polar regions collections, I found historical records and local histories that occasionally mentioned Byers Lake, but primarily in the context of mining claims and early settlements. One slim volume on anomalous experiences in the Alaskan wilderness caught my attention. Published in 1987 by a regional press, it compiled first-hand accounts from trappers, prospectors, and bush pilots who reported unusual phenomena while isolated in remote areas. Most of the stories involved unexplained lights, strange sounds, or temporary disorientation. Fascinating, but not directly relevant to my experience. However, buried in the middle of the book was an account that made my blood freeze. A trapper named William described an incident from the winter of 1976 when he was checking his lines near the Susitna River, not far from Byers Lake. I saw myself standing about 50 yards away, dressed exactly as I was. It raised its hand when I did, mirroring my movements. I fired a warning shot, and it disappeared into the trees. That night, my cabin burned down with all my supplies. I would have frozen to death if another trapper hadn't found me. I've never returned to that region, and I never will. The account was brief, lacking the details I desperately wanted, but the similarities were undeniable. Like me, William had encountered what appeared to be his own doppelganger in the wilderness, not far from where my experience had occurred. I photographed the page with my phone and continued searching, but found no other accounts that closely matched what I had experienced. By closing time, I had compiled a small collection of potentially relevant information, though nothing that provided the clear explanation I sought. That evening, when my mother returned from her shift, I finally broke down and told her everything. I expected skepticism or concern about my mental state, but her reaction surprised me. "You're not the first person I've heard talk about something like this," she said quietly after I finished my account. "One of the nurses at the hospital mentioned similar stories. Apparently there's a name for it among some of the local indigenous communities, the echo people. According to what my mother had heard, these phenomena were particularly associated with frozen lakes and riverbeds. Reflection and duplication seemed to be common elements in the accounts, though she couldn't provide specifics beyond that. The nurse didn't go into detail, she explained. She just mentioned it was why some locals avoid certain areas during winter months, particularly at dusk. This scrap of information provided little comfort, but did suggest I wasn't alone in my experience. Whatever I had encountered at Byers Lake had been seen by others, enough to generate local lore and avoidance behaviors. I spent the remaining days of my visit in Fairbanks, venturing out only for brief errands and always in my mother's company. I found myself unable to sleep without a light on, constantly checking windows and doors to ensure they were secured. When I did sleep, my dreams were filled with pursued figures through endless snow, or worse, standing face to face with myself, watching my features shift into something inhuman. It's been a year since my experience at Byers Lake. I've since returned to Oregon and resumed my normal routines, but the incident has left an indelible mark on my psyche. I've spoken to a therapist about the experience, framing it cautiously as a panic attack triggered by isolation and harsh conditions. The explanation seems plausible enough from a clinical perspective, and the resulting treatment for anxiety has been somewhat helpful. But in the deepest part of myself, I know what happened was not a hallucination or a panic response. The terror I felt standing on that frozen shore was primal and authentic. The figure I saw was physically present, whatever its true nature might have been. I've continued my research in the months since returning home. I've connected with folklorists specializing in Alaskan indigenous traditions and corresponded with authors of books on wilderness phenomena. Their insights have provided context, but no definitive answers. Among the Athabascan peoples of interior Alaska, there are indeed stories of entities that can assume human form, particularly mimicking specific individuals. These beings are not considered supernatural in the Western sense, but rather part of the natural world, aspects of reality that most people rarely encounter. They are said to be drawn to liminal spaces and times, frozen lakes where water exists in transformed states, dusk and dawn, when day transitions to night, spring and fall when seasons change. What they want from humans varies in different accounts. Some stories suggest they seek to replace those they mimic, while others portray them as warnings or omens. In some traditions, seeing one's doppelganger indicates imminent danger, not necessarily from the entity itself, but from the natural environment or one's own actions. I've also discovered scientific research on the psychological effects of extreme isolation and Arctic environments. Arctic hysteria, or piblocto, is a documented condition involving hallucinations and irrational behavior, historically observed among indigenous populations during long winter months. Some researchers suggest similar states can affect anyone exposed to extended isolation in extreme environments, potentially explaining some wilderness encounters. But these explanations feel incomplete. They don't account for the specific details of my experience, the perfect mirroring of movement, the sense of recognition that transcended visual perception. Whatever stood across that frozen lake knew me in a way that defies conventional understanding. The experience has changed me in subtle but profound ways. I've developed a heightened sensitivity to reflective surfaces, mirrors, still water, even windows at night. I avoid looking at my reflection for too long, uncomfortable with the irrational fear that it might move independently or reveal something behind me. I no longer hike alone, and I've declined opportunities to travel to remote areas, regardless of the season. Most significantly, I live with a persistent sense that reality is thinner than we perceive, that beneath the ordered world we navigate daily lies something vast and unknowable, occasionally visible through cracks in our understanding. My mother completed her assignment in Fairbanks and has since moved on to other locations. She respects my decision never to return to Alaska, though she occasionally mentions the stunning landscapes and unique communities I'm missing. What she doesn't understand, what I haven't fully communicated, is that I believe whatever I encountered is not confined to that particular place. I've never seen my doppelganger again, but I sometimes feel its presence, particularly in moments of transition or liminality. In the space between wakefulness and sleep, in the fog-shrouded moments of early morning, in empty parking lots as dusk deepens tonight. There's a subtle awareness of something watching, waiting just beyond the edge of perception. Perhaps that's the most disturbing legacy of my experience at Byers Lake. The understanding that we are never truly alone, even in the most isolated places. Something watches from the margins of our reality, wearing our faces, mirroring our movements, waiting for recognition. I don't know what would have happened had I walked across that frozen lake toward my duplicate. Would it have fled as I approached? Would it have spoken with my voice? Would we have exchanged places, leaving me trapped in some twilight existence while it continued my life? These questions haunt me still, circling in my mind during sleepless nights. The answers, if they exist, remain beyond my reach. Just like the true nature of what stood watching me across a frozen Alaskan lake on that snowy April afternoon.